am Mike Strolla. I'm co-chair of the Basic Ed Funding Commission, and I'd like to call this hearing to order. For everyone's information, this meeting will be recorded and is streamed live online. I would encourage everyone to silence their phones, because otherwise the cameras will turn on you and we will point you out. No. Before I begin, I'd like to ask Vicki to take the roll call.
Here.
Krug. Here. Miller.
Here.
Ortitai.
Here.
Phillips-Hill.
Here.
Rothman.
Here.
Schreier.
Here.
Sturla.
Here.
Tupper.
Here.
Warner. Williams. Here.
Thank you. We'll now open it up for some opening remarks. Co-chair Phillips-Hill, do you have any comments?
Well, I do. Thank you so much, Co-Chair Sturla. Today marks the first of nearly a dozen public meetings the Commission will hold across the Commonwealth. And I want to welcome today's testifiers as well as members of the public who are here in person and those who are watching virtually. The Commission is reconstituted according to law every 5 years. However, due to COVID, we were statutorily delayed by an additional 3 years. So leading up to today, I have been frequently asked what my goal is with this commission and what my desired outcome is. For all of us on this commission to be effective, we cannot have a preconceived idea of what this commission will, where it will go, or what its outcome will be. So we need to listen to everyone. We may like what we hear, we may not like what we hear, but we need to work together in a bipartisan fashion to craft a well-thought-out recommendation for the General Assembly regarding funding of the Commonwealth's education system in a way that ensures that the system put in place by the General Assembly can appropriately serve the needs of our students. And with that, I'm going to heed my own advice. I listen to the testifiers who are here today and turn it back to Chairman Sturla.
Thank you. Representative Schreier, do you have any remarks?
Very briefly, and Chairman, I want to thank both you and Senator Phillips-Hill for choosing Allentown for the first spot of the basic education funding hearings. Furthermore, I'd like to thank you both for the incredible amount of effort that you've both put into what is going to be a very, very busy series of hearings. The logistics behind it alone are enough to keep staff busy, and I know both of you have done an exceptional job of communicating with members, communicating with the public to make sure that that we're able to have a series of hearings that drill down to the goal at hand, which is making sure that all of our children have access to the best education possible. And in light of the recent court case, these hearings have taken on a special meaning. Also, to the public, welcome to the Allentown School District. This is not only my legislative district, this is not only a place that I care about because I'm elected here. My two children are students in this school district. And as you see this room that was very ably decorated in somewhere between 1958 and 1972, we are having a conversation today in large part, not exclusively, but in large part about school facilities. This is a school district that has around a $450 million budget. We have 16,100 students in the Allentown School District, with about another 6,500 in charter schools, making our total school age population 23,000, give or take, when it's all said and done, when you count the smaller little pockets, the CTEs and such around us. We have multiple union contracts, and we are grossly and terribly underfunded. We know that, and we're going to be hearing testimony to that point. And nowhere do you see it more acutely than in our school buildings. Originally, I was going to host this hearing at Harrison Morton Middle School, which was built next year. We will be celebrating our 150th year of continued use. That is not something to be celebrated. That is something to be embarrassed by, not only with our community, but with the Commonwealth with continued underfunding in schools. And so, but because it's a school day and security is a major concern at that school in terms of ingress and egress, we decided to host it here. So if anybody is photosensitive, I apologize in advance for the carpeting. Anyway, but with the goal of making sure we move these conversations forward, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Senator Nick Miller, for a few comments, if I could, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to excellent testimony today. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Schweier. My name is Senator Nick Miller. I had the honor and privilege to serve on the Allentown School Board. So when on my last day before I resigned, I said I wasn't going far and didn't think I'd be back this soon. But it's on a good note, to talk about the realities of underfunding in school districts. An example being COVID. And in Allentown School District, we saw $100+ million come from the federal government, and poor school districts like this one had to use that for facility upgrades for stuff as simple as air conditioning, where other school districts were investing those dollars in lost learning. School districts that were underfunded had to invest it in buildings. We should be investing in that in students. And I think that just kind of exacerbated the impacts of the pandemic. And then having the court ruling, knowing that we're unconstitutionally funding our school districts, we have to have a sense of urgency around investing in our education. We talk all the time about economic development, attracting families to invest in PA, put down their roots. But if we don't invest in our education system, that's not going to happen. So that's first and foremost. So my goals here is to bring that sense of urgency to that investment and to build a consensus around something that can get through the General Assembly. So I want to thank my colleagues for coming to Allentown. Beautiful Allentown here, beautiful day here. Really looking forward to the conversation and the testimony. So thank you, Representative Schweier.
I'll point out we've been joined by Senator Hughes. As was pointed out earlier, the recent court decision talked about things that we need to do here in the state of Pennsylvania, among those being adequacy, equity, and timeliness. Without those, I don't think we're going to get to a constitutional resolution of how we fund education. And to that end, I'll call up our first testifier, Dr. Matthew Kelly, who's an assistant professor at Penn State University.
Chair Sturla, Chair Phillips-Hill, and members of the Basic Education Funding Commission. My name is Matthew Kelly. I'm a school funding scholar from Penn State, and I serve as an expert witness for petitioners in the school funding litigation, where I spent 3 days testifying about the inequity and inadequacy of the Commonwealth's current school funding system. To give a little background about myself, my research concentrates on state education funding policies and their consequences for the distribution of educational resources and opportunities. I earned my PhD from Stanford University in 2018. I've published widely on school funding policies, including state education funding policies here in the Commonwealth. I understand that in compliance with the decision of the Commonwealth Court, the Basic Education Funding Commission has set out to develop a school funding system that provides adequate and equitable funding and delivers all children an opportunity to meet state goals and standards. Accordingly, as I did during my testimony at trial, I'll use the state's own data, measures, and definitions to describe 3 things that those data, measures, and definitions show about the Commonwealth's current funding system. First, I'll describe the funding difficulties facing the poorest school districts. These districts are not able to provide their students with an adequate opportunity to meet state standards. Second, I will describe...
If I could,
Yeah.
we failed to swear you in. We got
well.
to swear in our witnesses, so.
Yes, thank you. I
right.
apologize. Yeah.
We don't normally swear people in the house, so do you guys know what you're doing here? All right. All right. Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do, yes, yeah.
Okay, all
Thank
right,
you.
thank you.
And
Here
that
we go.
applies to my
All right.
previous comments as well. So, And so I'll describe three things. The first is the funding difficulties that are facing the poorest districts. These are districts that cannot provide their students with an adequate opportunity to meet state standards. The second thing I will describe is how much the districts who are providing an adequate opportunity to their students are currently spending. And I'm going to define adequate opportunity here as the state does, and that means using the state's interim targets for academic performance and graduation rates from their ESSA consolidated plan. Third, I will describe what this means for all districts and provide an approximation of what each district needs to meet state interim standards. And again, this is based on the state's own numbers and the state's own definitions. Just to briefly provide an overview relative to the financial difficulties facing the poorest districts in the Commonwealth, I would note that these districts have the least amount of taxable wealth. They have the lowest ability to generate funding at the local level through taxation on their own without additional state support. They have the highest student-related costs and the greatest need for additional funding. We can see that using the state's own adjustments from the BEF and SEF formulas. They spend the least despite having the greatest need. They spend the least despite having an average tax rate in equalized mills that is higher than that of the wealthiest quintile of districts. And they're the furthest from meeting the goals the state has set for them. And it's important to emphasize that students from low-income families can succeed when they're given adequate financial resources. And we can see this in state data when we examine students from low-income families in those wealthy districts with the highest levels of funding relative to other low-income students in the poorest quintile of districts with less funding. These low-income students in the wealthiest quintile have higher standardized test scores. They have higher graduation rates. They have higher rates of entering post-secondary education. They have higher rates of graduating from college degree programs within 6 years. And this is consistent across different state measures and outcomes where we see these large gaps between the wealthiest and poorest quintile of districts. Turning to adequacy, during my testimony at trial, I calculated adequate funding using section 2502.48 of the school code, which comes from that 2008 formula based on the previous costing out study conducted for the state. And as I noted at trial, that formula uses different weights than the current BEF formula. It doesn't take into account a number of critical costs that are confronting districts. That includes special education. And it doesn't take into account the more rigorous college and career standards that students are required to meet today. And so accordingly, for the commission, I set about answering a similar but slightly different question. Using the state's most current weights in both the fair funding formula and the special education funding formula, and so fair funding formula, basic education funding formula, as everyone well knows, what is the typical spending needed for a school district to meet the state's goals for high school graduation rates and proficiency on state exams? This adequacy study was designed to identify how much additional funding, if any, each school district in the Commonwealth would need to be able to give their students an effective opportunity to meet state standards. And just a few, and I described this in more detail in my written testimony, but just a few of the goals that guided producing these estimates and answering this question. I wanted to provide transparent, comprehensive, and reasonable estimates of how much funding each district would need to meet state standards, and make those estimates the most conservative possible that can be generated from current state data without violating basic empirical standards that we need to follow, established by school funding scholars and established in previous adequacy studies. I also, as a goal, wanted to utilize weights and costs that are already embedded in Pennsylvania law and previously acknowledged and identified in studies of cost differentials across the Commonwealth. And those are the adjustments for cost differences in the BEF and SEF formulas. And so this meant identifying a base cost that, in combination with supplemental weights for student and district need-based factors that increase district costs, would allow me to identify an adequacy target for each district in the Commonwealth. In addition, I sought to use the most up-to-date information and data to generate these estimates. so that lawmakers can be confident additional areas of financial need excluded from earlier estimates are included here. And so that meant ensuring these estimates included special education costs, which were excluded from the previous estimates, charter school stranded costs, the dramatic increase in the school district share of PSER payments since the previous costing out study was completed and a previous base cost was identified, a more accurate data source for students in poverty that's more direct and capturing students educated by a district rather than the broader geographical community measure from the American Community Survey, and use current goals that the state has set for districts, and specifically interim targets that it set for districts, as indicated under its Every Student Succeeds Act plan. And I used those targets from the state itself to identify model school districts. And that's how adequacy studies start. They identify model districts that are currently providing students with an adequate opportunity to meet state standards, and then identify how much those districts are spending. And so those model districts and their spending levels can be identified using the state's own data regarding which districts are meeting state standards. And then using these criteria, I identified those districts that are meeting, as I mentioned, the interim statewide goals for high school graduation and academic achievement. So next, I identified a base cost for each of those model districts, and that's defined as the per student current spending in those districts for a student with no identified needs under either the BEF or SEF formula. And so in other words, I examined the effective spending with districts for a student who is not from, with model districts, not from a low-income family, does not have an English language learner designation, does not receive special education services, is not in a charter school, and is not in a sparse district. And so then, because my goal was to achieve the most reasonable estimate of costs, I eliminated spending outliers, so removed some of these really high spending districts, and identified the median base cost in model districts. I then applied the base cost to each district's weights identified under the basic education and special education funding formulas to ensure that these adequacy targets generated were adjusted for need. And so put differently, I identified what the typical successful Pennsylvania district is spending relative to its needs, and then applied that target spending across each of the Commonwealth's districts. And those districts spending less than their targets are those who are identified as having an adequacy shortfall. And so based on the comparison between each district's current spending and its adequacy target, again, identified using the state's own data, measures, standards, and goals, there were 412 school districts in the Commonwealth that spent less than they needed to meet their adequacy target in the most recently released state funding data. These districts educated 83% of the students in the Commonwealth. I should say we're fiscally responsible for about 83% of the students in the Commonwealth. They are located across the state in 64 of the Commonwealth's 67 counties. In aggregate, adequacy shortfalls across districts were about $6.2 billion, and that's about 20% of current expenditures. The median shortfall across the Commonwealth's districts is $2,572 per ADM, and that figure includes districts without a shortfall in its calculation. And then about 50% of the Commonwealth's districts had a shortfall that was greater than $2,000 per average daily member. And while I've been addressing the importance of adequacy, I must also observe that addressing these adequacy shortfalls will significantly address equity issues identified by the court. And to quote the court, students who reside in school districts with low property values and incomes are deprived of the same opportunities and resources as students who reside in school districts with high property values and incomes. A majority of model districts are in the wealthiest quintile. There are 0 model districts in the poorest quintile. Districts in the wealthiest quintile account for only 2% of the current adequacy shortfall. Districts in the poorest quintile account for 51% of the statewide adequacy shortfall, even though they are only fiscally responsible for 20% of students. $6 billion is a significant amount of money, but these estimates are in many ways conservative. And so I'll close by noting the ways in which these estimates are conservative. And first, these shortfalls do not consider financial need in relation to facilities, including those districts who have years' worth of deferred maintenance impacting their facility needs and costs. Second, these shortfalls do not consider need related to pre-K, including need related to pre-K that will increase these shortfalls substantially, and I provide an estimate of that increase in my written testimony. Third, these shortfalls do not consider the increased costs some districts incur because of their higher cost of living in the section of the Commonwealth where they are located. Fourth, the relative weights that the Commonwealth adopted in the special education funding formula are different than the relative student costs identified in the underlying Independent Fiscal Office and SEF Reconstituted Commission's report, and those are the weights that are used here. And so if I use the statutory cost differentials to adjust for special education, that will increase the total shortfalls by $500 million. Fifth, the standard used to identify model districts produces a conservative base cost estimate. The state has set goals for improvement for students called interim targets. These are lower than the state's goals for 2033, and they increase each year. And so practically speaking, this means districts who are meeting interim targets this year and have been used to identify the base cost for all districts, they still must improve if they're going to meet state goals in the years ahead. And so it's reasonable to assume that districts who are at adequacy under this calculation may indeed need more funding in the future. And so the purpose, again, of the study is to answer a specific question, which is based on the typical model Pennsylvania district. What is a reasonable estimate of adequate funding, excluding facilities, pre-K costs, and any costs of increased state academic goals? That number is significant at $6.2 billion. I recognize the serious task of the commission, and I'm happy to assist in that work however I can, and I thank you for your time.
Yes, so we'll take questions now from members. Chair Phillips-Hill.
Well, Dr. Kelly, thank you very much for your testimony. A lot of data to process, and really appreciate you quantifying all of that. Have some questions with regard to that estimate of the adequacy gap that you have put forward in your testimony here today. In your testimony before the courts, you stated that the adequacy gap was $4.2 billion. That was 2 years ago. In that subsequent time frame, the General Assembly has put records amount of funding into basic education. So can you explain why that estimate of the adequacy gap that you are projecting has grown approximately $2 billion from the testimony that you provided to the court to the testimony that you're providing here today?
Thank you very much, Chair Phillips-Hill, for that question. And so the adequacy shortfalls that I described, as I noted in my testimony, were based on the 2008 formula's definition of what an adequacy target was for a district. And as I noted during trial and in my testimony at the time, that $4.6 billion shortfall was in many ways conservative because it didn't take into account a series of really critical funding areas for districts. And so because, for example, it was connected to the distribution of basic education funding, that section of the school code didn't take into account the need that districts would have relative to special education. And so these estimates do take into account special education, which was not true of the previous estimates. And so
That the only factor that you have
Sure.
changed
Thank
from
you.
your court testimony until your testimony here today?
Thank you. Yeah. So there's a number of additional factors that are taken into account here that are not taken into account when we calculate an adequacy target using the state's 2008 formula. And so in addition to special education, there's been a dramatic increase since the original costing out study was conducted to calculate and estimate a base cost and the share of districts, their required share of PSERS payments. And so that's being taken into account here. It was not previously being taken into account. There's been an increase in the number of students from low-income families since that estimate as well. And this also is using the current weights from the BEF and SEF formula. And so those weights are different and in some cases slightly higher than the weights that were embedded in the 2008 formula. And so there are a number of ways that I've tried to outline as clearly as possible in the written testimony that these estimates are addressing cost areas that have not previously been included. So I wanted to make sure that those are included so it's as comprehensive as possible. And
So
I'm
if
happy to
you
talk.
look
Yeah.
apples to apples, the number that you provided to the courts in your testimony there, and using the exact same factors based on the massive investment of dollars into basic education funding over the last 2 years, what is the number?
So I would have to run the calculation following the 2008 formula, but one of the things about the formula is it specifies that the base cost will be increased by the Act 1 index. And so the base cost itself will be increasing by the Act 1 index under the 2008 formula. And so the base cost that would be used for a previous year's calculation would be increased by the Act 1 index to adjust for inflation. And so the base cost itself would be increasing if we follow the specific calculations from that 2008 formula. And so we would have to run that calculation, but again, it wouldn't include really critical areas of need for districts. So special education funding, to give one example, would be a large area of need that's not factored in if we were to update that 2008 formula for the most recent AFR data, which would be 2021 to 2022.
So essentially, what you're saying is the definition of what you believe to be basic education has expanded to include a multiple additional factors that have not been previously considered basic education. For example, we have a separate special education funding, we have a separate special education commission, and so you are adding additional factors, and that is the result of that increase in your testimony 2 years ago to the courts versus today.
Yeah, so as I noted at the time, the 2008 formula was not comprehensive, and so the estimates that I shared at the time were very conservative because of that. And all of these cost areas, including special education, they're going to impact the resources that a district needs and the extent to which a district is able to provide students with an opportunity to meet the standards the state has set for them. And so what I've tried to do here is take into account as many of those cost factors as possible, though even now I'm still not taking into account cost factors in areas like facilities. I tried to provide an estimate of what an additional cost related to pre-K would be, but that's not embedded in this particular estimate.
So pre-K is not embedded in this cost.
The aggregate figure I shared, yes. But so in the written report, I do estimate, based on an estimate of the number of unserved eligible pre-K students, what the additional shortfall would be
So
if that's
you
taken
are
into
aware
account.
that in last year we had 2,800 unfilled pre-K seats, and we still paid for those seats to the tune of $28 million. Did you factor in that?
So that data was not data that I particularly looked at here, and so in terms of the estimate, I tried to be as clear about it as possible. So I use an estimate of the number of unserved students, and then what the rate would be for each of those students based on the guidance that.
I think it's important to understand that we have 28,000 empty seats, so that would certainly factor in unserved students. I will tell you this, right? I can remember vividly being in graduate school, and Dr. Cliff Zukin said to me, Ms. Phillips, if you remember one thing and one thing only from your quantitative research methods course, it is this: numbers are your friends. They'll tell you what you want them to say. So I think we have to have a really clear idea of what exactly you're including and not including, because it's going to make a big difference to kids and school districts and taxpayers all across the state. The one last thing, if I may, Mr. Chairman, you pretty much assume a status quo for how the money gets into education, right? So have you contemplated or looked at any other ways that we can generate revenue to fund education other than the existing status quo model?
So in terms of the revenue side, I'm focusing on the state's own data's measures and definitions relative to both the goals that it has set for school districts, And then also the specific weighting factors the Commonwealth has identified, which are consistent with what we know from research about the additional costs that districts will encounter. And so I haven't looked as closely at the revenue side or how revenue is generated. My focus here, and that's why I didn't share, for example, the 2008 formula had a state funding target. And so I didn't share a state funding target or calculate that. And so I'm not thinking here particularly about the revenue side. I'm looking at using the state's own measures, its own data, its own definitions, spending within model districts, and what an approximation would be if that was extended to all districts across the Commonwealth.
Very good. I think we have to be concerned both about how the money gets into the system, how the money's distributed throughout the system. So thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Chairman.
Thanks. Representative Schwer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of follow-ups, Dr. Kelly. So I want to be abundantly clear and try to make these answers as concise as possible. The single biggest difference between, the two biggest differences, rather, between your testimony in court from a numbers perspective and today is the inclusion of special education and the inclusion of PSERS pension calculations, correct?
In addition, the 2008 formula was based on a base cost calculated under an earlier set of state standards. And so these are more rigorous college and career-ready standards that the state has set for students today, and so that's an additional factor that would be added here. And so there's a series of factors, but the largest one certainly those.
So those two, along with policy changes that the Commonwealth has made to address our goals of what our children should, the standards that our students should be at. So decisions that have been largely made by the Commonwealth.
Yes, where I have tried to consistently base all of this on decisions by the Commonwealth.
So you're not making this up. This is what we've done.
No.
Okay. All right. I think that's important to mention because what you're talking about is you're responding to what we have set forth as standards and goals for us to say. You did not include facilities in pre-K, which is an interesting choice because if I'm not mistaken, both of those were also part of the judge's ruling with regard to the lawsuit. Am I correct about that?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So that 6.2 number is really including a lot, but certainly not two major factors that the judge specifically said have to be included as we're looking at adequacy and equity, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And so in your written testimony, you include an estimate based on data that you have available for pre-K, but nothing on facilities, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So the single biggest change, if I could go back to your conversation between several years ago before the court and today, is actually not policy decisions that we made. It's not the inclusion of several things that were talked about in the court case. The single biggest difference between then and today is the fact that we now have a Commonwealth Court ruling that includes all of this stuff, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So we can have a conversation about trying to get to apples comparisons, and I think there's a significant value to the senator's point to do that. I think that there's an important conversation to have, and this is where we were back in 2008 before, frankly, many of us were legislators at the time, and today. But the single biggest difference between those two things is the fact that we now have a court case in our hands that says that we need to start factoring these things into our overall conversation and what we're going to do with education funding. That's a fair statement?
Yeah, I think that would be a fair statement. I would emphasize, as I noted in my written testimony, that addressing adequacy shortfalls will also substantially address equity gaps identified by the court as well, that
Okay.
these are linked.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I'm good, thanks.
Thanks. Senator Rothman.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. Thank you for being here and testifying. One of the things I did not see in your study is that how the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania compares to other states in total spend per student, including local, state contribution, even federal. Where do we rank compared to other states? My data has me about 6th or 7th, maybe tied with Illinois, maybe New York, Vermont, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts. How do we compare to other states, especially when we're competing with other states for population? And then how do we compare with other developing countries? in amount of money that we spend? I mean, since really this discussion is about how much money we're spending, not results, but spending.
Sure. So thank you for that question. State comparisons, and especially I think international comparisons, are difficult because we want to make sure that we are comparing kind of apples and apples. And so there can be very real challenges in making those kinds of comparisons. And I've noted previously, for example, some of the ways that data can be used from the NCES can artificially inflate the spending of some districts in the Commonwealth by not accounting for pass-through funding from charter school students, so including the funding for those students in the numerator, but excluding those students from the denominator. And so it gets tricky, I think, to really make these kinds of comparisons. And one of the other things that I would emphasize is when we're looking at a total average figure, such as the average spending in the Commonwealth, that's not telling us much about equity or adequacy, because the extent to which those funds are evenly and equitably distributed is not going to be as readily apparent from a figure like that. And nor will the extent to which districts have adequate funding to be able to meet state standards. And so, I think we really want to incorporate that information into those kinds of comparisons. And if we look at, for example, the share of total funding that comes from the state within the Commonwealth relative to other states, Pennsylvania is very much an outlier in the extent to which it's reliant on local property wealth and local incomes and that local taxable pot of wealth to fund its schools. And so that's a major equity linked to adequacy issue that I think is important for contextualizing that. And so that figure sounds like it could be correct, but it really needs to be carefully contextualized up to and including making sure the data itself, the underlying data, is adequately dealing with the unique structure of funding in the Commonwealth so that it's an accurate representation of per pupil funding.
Yeah, and we also, if I could ask another question, Mr. Chairman, we also are a Commonwealth that has 500 plus school districts, as opposed to other states that may have county-wide school districts and other, when you talk about how the funding comes from. The expression in my business, and maybe you've experienced this too in science, is that thousands of examples don't necessarily prove a theory, but one can disprove a theory. In your spending line, I refer to you to Cumberland Valley High School in Cumberland County. I know it very well. I represent it. I'm a graduate of Cumberland Valley High School, as was my older sister, younger brother. I've had 3 kids graduate from it. I have 1 child in it and 1 getting ready to go to it. You have Cumberland Valley High School having a $29 million and a close to $3,000 per student inadequacy. Cumberland Valley High School is probably one of the best schools in the region, maybe in the state, for graduation rates, for test performance. But most importantly, it's the fastest growing school district in the fastest growing county in the Commonwealth because parents are taking their kids there. So they only spend $15,600 a year, and yet they have parents and kids moving in droves to go to this great school district. So, but thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Argel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like Senator Phillips-Hill, I'm struggling with memories of my multivariate statistics classes back at Penn State and so many different factors. I'm curious in that many of us, I certainly have supported a lot of significant funding increases for education in the past. We now spend, of course, more than we have ever before, and yet we haven't seen the results that many had hoped for. If we were to follow your recommendation for an additional $6 million, which would be, of course, by far the largest tax increase in the history of Pennsylvania, how could you guarantee us that this time we'll see the results that we would all desire?
So the research is clear, it's unambiguous. We know that money matters for student outcomes, and that when we increase spending, we will increase outcomes for students. This is not an unsettled matter.
Hasn't been the case with some of our past increases. The test scores went down.
So this is a well-settled area of research. And so, what we could say is that if districts don't have the resources that they need, which I've sought to estimate here using the state's own measures and data, they will not be able to give students that opportunity to improve their performance and meet these goals and targets that the state has set for them. And so we certainly know that increased spending does increase outcomes. We certainly know that these estimates are based on the targets that the state has set for graduation rates as well as academic achievement in its ESSA plan. And then they are accounting for need using the weights that have been embedded into the basic education and special education funding formulas.
I think we all agree on the goal. I'm just, based on our past experiences, not sure how we're going to get there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks. Representative Isaacson.
Thank you. And obviously, our past experience has brought us to the point where we have this lawsuit conclusion that we were not doing it the proper way. So thus, we are here trying to figure it out so that we can make sure that we're educating our children and not losing another generation. And I appreciate very much, Senator Phillips-Hill, you bringing up the pre-K. As somebody with an early childhood background in education, I am very much in favor of making sure we're capturing children as early as possible. And we should do everything we can to increase those pre-K numbers, but perhaps we should be redoing an entire formula with regard to education where pre-K is a part of basic education so that we're not trying to figure out the number problem that we have because numbers are our friends. And for that matter, it would be really great as a follow-up if you could just maybe do a list of your testimony, of what you included, so it's very clear to us what you're basing your analysis on, because we had to have the conversation, are facilities included in this, which is one of the huge things, because we are a developed country, not an undeveloped country, but some of our school district schools look like they belong in an undeveloped country, and we need to make sure that we include that funding so that we show the children how much we care about them and give them a good facility to learn so that they have a proper place to go. So if you could provide that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So the estimates are looking at current expenditures, and so that's in 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, and so facilities would end up in a funding category that's not included here, and so not kind of examining that in formulating the base cost relative to model districts, and then not factoring that in to the calculations for districts. And so I think pre-K and facilities are the kind of major pieces not being taken into account here, as well as the model districts are identified based on meeting state interim targets and not the long-term 2033 goals. And so each year, the interim targets are increasing, and so we could expect that there's an increase as well in that expectation that's going in for identifying those schools and those districts that are meeting the standards that the state has set for it. And so I think that those are the major factors, but in terms of, there's 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 in the expenditure codes, and so facilities and then other expenditure uses, that's completely excluded from the calculations here, and so it's not captured.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Representative Topper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Dr. Kelly. If you're an expert in formulas, correct? I'm not, so I'm just establishing that you're the expert here in formulas.
Yes, so I'm using the state's own formulas. Yes.
Right. So let's talk about that formula for just a second. It's a hybrid of an old formula and a new formula. We passed a new formula over the past several years since many of us have been in office, but only new money flows through that formula. If all the money were to flow through that formula, would that change your number? In other words, how much of the how much of your factors take into account the fact that a lot of it is still being run through a different formula and new money is being run through a separate formula?
Thank you for that question. So when we look at the amount of money that's held harmless in aggregate, it's much smaller than the aggregate shortfall. And so we would, I could rerun those data and share it. But what we would find based on the magnitude of all these figures is that there are often a number of districts that small rural districts that have an adequacy shortfall. That would lose money if all the dollars were filtered through the formula, and they already are starting with a shortfall. And so, we would want to run this on a district-by-district basis, but the amount held harmless within the basic education funding formula would not, if distributed through that formula, close the adequacy shortfalls of this magnitude.
But it would also fundamentally change the outcomes for some of those school districts in terms of how much money they receive.
It would change for some districts, but the shortfalls themselves, it would not make an overall material difference in the magnitude of shortfall. So essentially, there's, the problem is that the pie itself is too small. And so even if we try to reslice a pie that's too small, that's not going to change the broader challenge here, which is there's not enough money in the system. And so, the money needs to be both sufficient, so the pie needs to be large enough, and then it also needs to be distributed equitably.
So in your opinion, is distribution an issue? In other words, if I put $6.2 billion tomorrow into the current structure, you believe the current structure can distribute that as is?
So those dollars would need to be directly connected to the current characteristics of the districts receiving them. And so they would need to not be subject to a hold harmless provision that would prevent a district with an adequacy shortfall from receiving funds intended to address that shortfall.
So as we move forward in our job and duties as a commission, we need to look at both amount and the structure that it's put into. In other words, the formula?
Yes, but the big piece is that if the pie itself is too small, no matter how it's split up, it's not going to change that broader kind of reality. And so the pie itself needs to be adequate, and then it needs to be distributed in relation to district need. But we can't just reslice a pie that's too small, because that won't address the
No, that's not
underlying
my
issues.
question.
Yeah.
My question is, with that kind of influx, with any kind of large influx of money, is the current structure adequate? In other words, is the oven big enough for the new pie we're putting in?
So I think if I understand your question correctly, a phase-in provision would be helpful to allow districts to kind of ramp up what they need to be able to kind of use these resources. And so we'd want to make sure that there are sufficient folks available to be hired, things like that. So I think a phase-in provision could and would certainly be something to take into account here to ensure that districts can ramp up the capabilities to use those funds.
That's what I'm looking for. I should have started with the kitchen analogies first. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Hughes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor, thank you very much. We really appreciate being able to rely on you and your information to help us deliberate the issues that we have in front of us and to help us come to a resolve which the President Judge of Commonwealth Court essentially demanded us to come to a resolve in a 800-page ruling, or 784. Someone told me to be more exacting than that. 784 pages. Two issues I want to highlight. How long has this been going on? How long has this unconstitutional and inadequate funding been going on?
Certainly, the original costing out study identified very large adequacy shortfalls, and every updated estimate using that formula is identifying these massive shortfalls. And then Certainly using an updated approach, trying to have as comprehensive as possible of an estimate is, we're finding a very large shortfall. And so, I don't know the deep history of the Commonwealth, but I would say that for as long as I have looked at specific data points relative to districts in the Commonwealth, there are very clear adequacy and equity gaps.
The costing out study, thank you, Representative, was done in 2008. I was around for that. But it was going on long before that. So again, trying to wrap our collective brain and hopefully our collective wisdom around what clearly is 2008, a generational problem, generations problem of historic underfunding. And I was looking through district by district, and $15,000 per student short, and $11,000 per student short, and in my own Philadelphia school district, if we made up that gap of $7,900 times 500 students, that's about $3.9 million in a particular school building annually. That I'm assuming, could change the outcomes for a lot of students. We have some teachers and superintendents, I'm sure we'll hear some input from that. But it's important to, I think, understand the generational reality of this. This lawsuit was filed, I believe, November 10th, 2014. And so that's 9 years. So a child was in first grade when it was filed, and when it was decided it was in 9th grade. So that child went to a school or a series of schools that were unconstitutionally funded and inadequately funded. So it's important to understand the history and the generational reality of this. Students in underfunded schools coming from whose parents probably went to underfunded schools, whose grandparents probably went to underfunded schools. So to the extent that you could provide the committee some sense of history with respect to this, like the representative said, I'm not a formula guy. You're a formula guy, all right? But at least some general context would be important.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's important to recognize that these are estimates for need within a given year, and that students really only have 1 year in kindergarten, right? And so each year that the Commonwealth system is not equitably and adequately funded, that's a child's year in kindergarten, and then their year in first grade and second grade and third grade. And this is going to compound over time. Districts that don't have the funds that they need on the facility side are going to have years of deferred maintenance, and all of these shortfalls and all of these gaps are going to add up over time for the Commonwealth. And so we know that one of the best things that a state could do is invest in its public education system in the long run. And so that will be a related cost as well that will come from not addressing the issue. But the research is crystal clear that when funding is increased and these gaps are addressed, it will improve both short and long-term outcomes for students. And so some of the studies have even looked into adulthood at measures like the probability that a child will experience poverty as an adult. And found that these increases in funding addressing equity and adequacy issues would decrease the probability that a child would experience economic distress later in life. And so the impact is far-reaching, and it will also follow the students throughout their trajectory within the education system and beyond.
Lastly, Mr. Chairman, it's important at some point the issue of facilities has got to be addressed. And I hope there's a way to get to some kind of calculation with respect to that. And we cannot separate out inadequate facilities from academic performance. You just can't separate it out. The obvious being asbestos, lead, things of that nature, the toxic reality of school buildings. But then we just had, one of the hottest weeks of the year last week, right? And at least in Philadelphia, but I know in some of the, a number of other school districts around the Commonwealth, many of them are the ones that are on the lawsuit, right? Okay. In Philadelphia, 84 school buildings had to be shut down early, half day, what have you, because of inadequate facilities. No air conditioning, poor ventilation, and what have you. That's lost learning time. That's not just a building shutting down. That's lost learning time. So we got to make sure that we factor in this issue of facilities because we can do what has to be done to upgrade the academic side of the conversation, investing in materials, in classrooms, investing in school personnel, investing in things of that nature. But if the building is shut down because it's toxic or it can't accommodate a very warm day or a very cold day, right, then that's lost learning time. And so I want to throw that out there. And then we don't necessarily have to address it now in this testimony, but there are high school students those high school students were in unconstitutional school buildings and inadequately funded school buildings until before they got up. And then something has to be done to get them whole, to get them where they need to be. And somewhere along the line, that has got to be factored in. How do we take so many students who've been wronged by the Commonwealth and get them right to make a better Commonwealth? So to the extent that we can get to a point where we can have those kinds of numbers added into the mix, Mr. Chairman, we'd love to hear more conversation about that at a later time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two quick questions. One thing is inflation and the gap between the initial testimony during the court hearings. How much has that played a factor between now and this estimate? Just a local example, we had a middle school project queued up for about $95 million for a middle school. Now that project estimated about $118 million. That was that 2-year time period inflation impacted. How has that impacted these weighted factors and cost?
So the base cost was calculated with data from this year, but I think that's a really important consideration when examining previous estimates. In addition to not taking into account all of these cost areas, inflation alone, if we look at the Act 1 index, I believe it's 4.1% for this coming year. And so inflation is certainly real, and districts are certainly feeling those kind of cost pressures. And we can see that using the Commonwealth's own kind of education-specific inflation index. And so that's absolutely another really important factor, I think, in contextualizing these figures relative to these earlier figures that were not taking into account a number of cost areas.
One more quick thing that Senator Argyle made a point about the investment that the Commonwealth has made over the last, let's just say, 5 years. Your estimate has the Allentown School District underfunded by $203 million annually. Let's just say over that 5 years, it's underfunded by $1 billion. That investment equates from the state about $75 million. So you're looking at about 7.5% of investment. You're looking for a return for improved school scores, test scores, and graduation rates. But I don't think that math doesn't add up. So small investment, great investment, much needed, but nowhere near the levels we need for all those years of being underfunded, to Senator Hughes' point. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. 2 quick questions from myself, and then I'm going to try and get us caught back up. because Senator Kristen Phillips-Hill has pointed out that she runs meetings on time, and I'm obviously way over, so. Yeah, so one thing, you pointed out that there were some differences in your first study and your second study from the court case, and we've talked about various factors. If we sit down as a commission and in our executive sessions and say, you know what, let's put PCERS over in a separate bucket, let's put special ed over in a separate bucket, let's put facilities over in a separate bucket, but we agree that here's the 10 factors that we think your adequacy study should look at. Can you redo these numbers and come back to us with another number to say, here's if you do these? Now, you still haven't addressed these other 12 factors, but here's what's in this bucket, and at least we'll be talking about, we'll agree that we won't say, I don't like your study because it shows one thing that I don't want you to. We'll say, well, it's a separate bucket. Is that something you can do for us?
Yeah, absolutely. As long as there's sufficient data, which I think there will be for anything that we would come up with, I'm happy to provide all of the data and rerun estimates and make sure that it's all clear and transparent. And for example, could rerun estimates with particular account areas taken out or added in. So long as it exists in the data, I would be more than happy to help however I can and make sure that you have the information that you need.
Okay. And then one final question, because this goes to, you talked about some of the factors and the weighting and some of those factors and things like that. If I have a school district that a majority of the kids go home to a two-parent family and both the parents have at least college degrees, some of them master's degrees, and there's no fear that I'm ever going to become homeless, and there's no abuse in the household, and all those other factors. I start school probably, and we know that if kids can read, write, and do arithmetic by the time they get done with third grade, that they're probably set successfully for life. Those kids are entering kindergarten or first grade, and they can already add, and they know their numbers, and they have a vocabulary that's a certain language, and they've experienced things in the world that some of their counterparts, who's maybe a single-family parent who experienced domestic abuse, who lives in a homeless shelter, that kid is worried about whether or not they're eating or whether they have a roof over their head, and has a vocabulary that's 1/3 of what the other child is. If we shortfall the first kid that I described by $1,000 a year, every study I've seen says, yeah, it has some impact, but it's not gonna make or break that kid. The other kid, if you shortfall them by $1,000 a year, and in some cases we're shortfalling these kids by $10,000 a year, it has a significant impact on their chances of succeeding. Is that reflected in your study?
I think that the data, yes, and so we see adjustments for all of these cost factors that are really critical and are going to shape the resources that a district would need to be able to provide its unique student population with an adequate opportunity to meet state standards. And so, those cost factors absolutely need to be taken into account. And those are taken into account using essentially, the state's own kind of weighting factors that it's developed in its formulas to adjust for those differences. And so, absolutely, I think that it's critical and it's a well-settled, I think, area that we would want to, on the research side, make sure we take into account those differences when we consider the funding that a district would need.
Follow-up to that. So I remember in the 2008 commission, or not 2008, when was it, 2013 or 15 or whenever we did the last commission, when we were looking at those factors, we also looked at other states, and you talk about, you've done this, you've seen what's going on in other states. These things are factors that are not outliers in terms of other states, correct? I mean, this is sort of the norm across the nation in terms of the kinds of factors that and weights that we've put on some of these things. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So it's consistent with the practice of other states, and it's consistent with research on kind of cost differentials. Those weights are. So absolutely, this is consistent with both the research and policy in other states.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll be back to you because we want to get more information from you at some point in time. I'm now going to call up our next panel. Dr. Birks, Superintendent of the Allentown School District, Dr. Jack Silva, Superintendent of the Bethlehem School District, and Lynn Oh, boy, you're going to get me. Fueini-Hetten, Superintendent of the Salisbury School District. And I will swear you all in as a panel, if you will. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before this commission will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Birks, you want to get us started?
Good morning. Say good morning to our esteemed members of the Basic Education Funding Commission, my fellow superintendent colleagues, and everyone assembled here today. Thank you for the opportunity to address you this morning. And thank you for your commitment to public service and to the betterment of the citizens of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I'm Dr. Carol D. Birks, and I am the proud superintendent for the Allentown School District. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Representative Peter Schweier and Senator Nick Miller, who I have the distinct pleasure to serve with every day in service to the students of Allentown School District. I appreciate your passion and your commitment and dedication to our great city of Allentown. The concern of students attending schools that are inequitably funded is not new for our district, and we've been very vocal in this matter many times prior to today. However, the question really is, how do we drive the conversation forward at this time to create a meaningful impact for our future leaders, teachers, doctors, scientists, attorneys, and maybe even elected officials? Providing equitable funding for urban school districts is a matter of social equity and fairness. The Educational Law Center and the Civil Rights Project at the UCLA, they've conducted research highlighting how funding disparities disproportionately affect marginalized communities, perpetuating cycles of poverty and inequality. Today, I sit here before you to address the importance of equitable funding for the 16,500 students who are sensational, creative, dynamic, creative, and all those great things here who attend the Allentown School District, and also advocating for the students across the Commonwealth. This morning, my focus is basically a matter of, it's very paramount. It's the physical infrastructure of Pennsylvania's schools. As we gather to discuss the inequitable delivery of education in our state's public schools, it is imperative that we recognize the critical role that school facilities play in fostering an environment conducive to learning and growth for all students, and creating supportive working conditions for our educators and staff. The Allentown School District serves as a microcosm of the challenges many districts across the Commonwealth face with regard to aging school infrastructures. Our district is comprised of 21 schools and 4 programs in which our students learn every day. Of those schools, 2/3, think about this, 2/3 of which are more than 50 years old, with a startling 12 school buildings that have exceeded the century mark. While we have diligently carried out many renovations, and I want to commend my team for doing that, and maintenance for schools, the truth remains that these aging structures struggle to accommodate the demands of modern 21st century learning. Our district feasibility study has determined that structurally, our school buildings remain sound, yet the passage of time has left them with physical deficiencies and hinder our ability to provide the quality education that every single student deserves. In the wake of new building codes and safety standards, our facilities face challenges that were unforeseen when they were originally constructed. The cost of addressing these deficiencies is projected to exceed, I'm going to say this number, $400 million. A staggering amount of required investment for the Allentown School District without state aid. Historically, Allentown has been underfunded to the tune of $200 million each year. Among the most pressing is that our schools contain outdated mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and fire protection systems, as well as non-existent air conditioning in many of our oldest schools. In total, these concerns collectively contribute to more than 70% of the estimated investment costs required to address these deficiencies. Some observers would suggest that the Allentown School District hasn't done enough to remedy these deficiencies. I want to reiterate, the Allentown School District has been grossly underfunded for many years, and the citizens of Allentown do care, and they are making investments in our public schools. In fact, the true reality is the students of Allentown have been denied basic educational access because of lack of funding. There's evidence that suggests that there's a correlation, very strong correlation, between school building infrastructure and student performance. Research has shown that well-maintained and modern school facilities can create a more conducive learning environment. Factors like lighting, air quality, classroom size, and overall school safety can impact students' ability to concentrate and learn effectively. Sadly, the students of Allentown are being denied some of the same opportunities and experiences as their more affluent and suburban counterparts that live just less than 5 minutes away from here. However, the answer is clearly, it's immediate reform of Pennsylvania's unconstitutional, school funding system as ruled by the Commonwealth Court back in February. Allentown needs action today. In the meantime, we are reminded about how funding inequities further exacerbate the opportunity gap in education for all students. I will provide a concrete example. Just last week, the extreme heat and the lack of air conditioning in our oldest schools caused the district to dismiss schools early for 4 days. As a result, our students had less learning time, and parents had to scramble for childcare and transportation. Dismissing 3 hours early for 4 days in a row in the beginning of the school year has led to 12 hours of missed learning for our students. Again, our suburban counterparts, they didn't have that. They didn't have to deal with those types of conditions and that type of treatment as a result of unfair funding. To provide a clearer picture of Allentown School District's challenges, let me briefly share the stories of 2 of our schools. First, we have Jefferson Elementary School. It was built in 1910, with an addition to that building in 1924. So just think about that. The school is 113 years old. Capital improvements over the next decade are projected to exceed $20 million, while a complete school renovation is estimated at $33.64 million. To construct a new 700-student elementary school as a replacement for Jefferson, the cost is estimated at $46 million. Secondly, we have our beautiful school, Harrison Morton. This school is 149 years old, and our friend Senator Hughes from Philadelphia had an opportunity to visit that school with us a few months back. So he's a witness for us. That school was built in 1874, and with 2 separate schools separated or merged. Its aging infrastructure fails to support modern educational models, safety measures, and technological advancements. Over the next 10 years, we anticipate needing approximately $30 million for capital improvements, with a complete renovation costing more than $42 million and reducing capacity of that particular building by more than 120 students. These numbers appear, they were extrapolated, not by us, by a feasibility study that was updated from 2021. Now, just imagine, now we're in 2023, so we know those numbers are much higher now. Just imagine how much these projections have gone up, affecting the rising inflation rates and cost of construction. To address these pressing matters, our district currently allocates $4 million annually for maintenance and safety measures. However, this falls far short of the financial support required to address the identified deficiencies. It is clear that without significant funding, our students' educational experiences will continue to be hindered by the limitations of our school buildings. More equitable state funding yet to be provided by state lawmakers following the Commonwealth Court's rulings would allow the Allentown School District to allocate more funding to infrastructure while also providing a more equitable education for our students. Equity lies at the heart of our mission and is the core of our focus and my personal focus as the superintendent for Allentown School District. Ensuring that all students have access to safe, modern, and effective learning environments is an essential aspect of achieving that goal. The implications of these aging school buildings extend beyond bricks and mortars, the brick and mortar. They influence our students' potential and shape their futures. What happens when families don't feel that we can do that? They remove their children from our schools. They look for different options. Let me give you another example. And it puts us in a situation that we can't be competitive and deliver to our families. Moser Elementary School was built, here's another school, in 1917. And Ritter Elementary School was built in 1925. Now, I told you about a few of our schools. We only have 25 schools. We're not like our colleagues down in Philadelphia. I've already mentioned several that are like 100 years old. In the catchment area of Moser Elementary School, 176 students opted to attend a charter school. In the Ritter neighborhood, 188 of them selected charter school options. Compare that to Ramos Elementary School. That school was built in 2010. And Hayes Elementary School was built in 2021. Now, both of these schools have larger catchment areas than Moser and Ritter, but Ramos only has 136 students who attend a charter school. In Hayes, a number is 110. So if you look at the differential, if you look at the enrollment of students in the catchment area, more of our students are selecting other options because there are more modern schools that are not traditional public schools to attend because of our aging infrastructure. At the middle school level, 319 students attend charter schools in Allentown, who would normally, their feeder pattern would be for them to attend Harrison Morton School. This is 50 more students than any other middle school and 100 students more than Trexler Middle School. We implore you today to consider the sense of urgency to come up with some solutions and to release funding so that our students will be able to be adequately prepared for college, for career, and for life beyond high school. It's detrimental what is happening to the children of Allentown. I truly believe that Allentown School District can become one of the highest school districts in the state of Pennsylvania. I believe that, but I can't do it without you, without your help, without your commitment. I want you up at night like me, thinking about how do we provide adequate funding and adequate experience, equity and access for all of the children in Allentown. They deserve it, they need it, We, as a collective body, are required to give it to them. I invite you to think about your own educational journeys when you were growing up, and the types of teachers and experiences and all the enriching experiences that you had, and that your children have had attending public educational system, in the public educational system if they attended public schools. The students in Allentown deserve just that and much more. Please, I implore you, to help ensure the success of the students who attend Allentown School District. Let's make the intentional and aggressive attempts to close the opportunity gap for them. They deserve it. Thank you, all of you legislators, for your service, for your dedication, for your commitment to the students for Allentown, and your advocacy for the students of Allentown and all of the children in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Thank you for your service.
Thank you. Dr. Silva?
First, thank you to Senator Phillips-Hill and Representative Sturla for the opportunity to provide testimony today. Special thank you to Senator Miller and Representative Schweier, who are local friends of education in Lehigh Valley. Let me introduce myself. My name is Jack Silva, and I'm honored to serve as the superintendent of the Bethlehem Area School District in my first year. This is not my first year in education, however. It's my 37th. I've spent half of those 37 years as a high school social studies teacher, followed by career in administration as an assistant principal, a curriculum director, and for the last 13 years, the assistant superintendent in the Bethlehem Area School District. So that background, all in public education, leads me not as an expert on formulas, but I hope to have a degree of expertise on education and what matters for children and families in public schools. Of course, there's a large financial context to what we're talking about today in this issue. Ultimately, it will require additional resources to develop and implement a roadmap to achieve a constitutional funding formula as per the decision of the state Supreme Court. To quote H.L. Mencken, one of my favorite phrases, when you hear someone say that it's not about money, it's about money. So we'll have to make some difficult financial choices at the legislative level, at the district level, and personal level as people make decisions about their education. Here are the priorities that I would recommend from my vantage point as superintendent in the Bethlehem Area School District. First, I might look a little tired this morning because I was up at 5 a.m., received a call from my facilities director that they were having a hard time maintaining power at Liberty High School in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The circuit kept going off, coming back on, going off, and ultimately at 6 a.m., not confident that I would be able to have students in a school that would have power or power that would stay on for the rest of the day, I canceled school for those students. That's 2,800 students missing 7 hours of instruction directly because of a over 50-year-old aging facility. We have 6 of those aging facilities in our school district. We have 22 schools serving over 13,000 very diverse students in diverse neighborhoods. 6 of those buildings are over 50 years old. Recently, we've been able to use federal funds to bring our capital plan more up to speed as we've renovated 8 elementary schools, especially the HVAC system. But that has not allowed us to get back to our district-funded capital plan, which monitors and maintains nearly $500 million in real estate assets. That capital plan is moving achingly slow in some areas, as our experience with Liberty High School this morning indicates. We are in the process of selecting one school, Fountain Hill Elementary School, for a $60 million new school project. That meant that William Penn Elementary School, Thomas Jefferson Elementary School, Liberty High School, Freedom High School, and East Hills Middle School, which are all over 50 years old, are going to have to wait. And they may have to wait a little bit longer because of the spiraling costs of school facilities projects are making us prioritize what we do. Now, our students are in good facilities in the Bethlehem Area School District. We work hard to maintain them, but their sheer age makes them a challenge over time. There are some recommendations from my point of view of some steps that the legislature could take to support some activities that were once funded at the state level, received a lot of bipartisan support, and at the beginning of my administrative career helped school districts like Bethlehem meet some of those challenges. And then I'll discuss just a few that might be some new areas that could bring greater equity and accountability to our programs. At one time, we did have a very robust Plan-Con reimbursement system that allowed us to work on that backlog list of schools to be able to make those renovations and avoid those types of closures. I would recommend that as far as school facilities, like what Dr. Birks has been talking about, get near the front of the line in the funding for those state funds. We now are encouraging our students more than ever to take dual enrollment opportunities at local colleges. Up until about 9 years ago, there used to be some reimbursement for especially high-need students with tuition costs and material costs of going to take a dual enrollment course. Now that no longer exists, and many students find themselves financially unable to have dual enrollment. We, at one point, used to have some financial reimbursement for the cost of charter school tuition, a cost that is $38 million annually in the Bethlehem Area School District. Now, the local taxpayers, 87% of whom who have children send them to the Bethlehem Area School District, are paying the additional cost of that choice for other families. So reestablishing some of those areas that had a lot of support and had a lot of positive effect and created a lot of opportunities for students could be a first step if there were more resources into the formula. Beyond that, there are some areas that, from my vantage point in the Bethlehem Area School District, could use a little support. Obviously, the teachers themselves, the certification needs, the sheer need of having new teachers and retaining excellent teachers. It is a hardship to student teach in Pennsylvania, where you're expected to basically student teach full-time, but have really no income. That limits the amount of opportunities, especially for student teachers of color, whom we are trying to recruit and increase into our teaching faculty. We are in need of creating systems and support for incentivizing teacher aides to become full-fledged teachers, especially in the areas of special education. That tuition assistance, that support, even a grow your own program within the Bethlehem Area School District would require some additional financing. We are a community school system in the Bethlehem Area School District. For those of you without the background in community schools, we have 9 of our schools have a full-time community school coordinator paid for in partnership with a local organization like Lehigh University. And there, that community school coordinator works in the school, right next to the principal, addressing all the needs of the students and families that many times schools cannot address. Things like mental health supports, vaccinations, vision vans, access to medical care, checkups, access to mental health services, parent education programs, mentoring programs, all reduce absence, increase student achievement, but are financed entirely at the cost of this community school model. We were visited by Secretary Cardona right at the height of the pandemic, and he said, my goodness, the reason these schools have been able to be responsive and be helping basic needs of families and students was because of the community school model. Our 2 high schools both have wellness centers and numerous partnerships with local agencies to meet the mental health crisis that's out there for students and families. Our food pantries and our clothing closets are busier than ever. We see a lot of housing insecurity. I know that that is not something that is easily addressed legislatively, but the community school model has been providing housing liaisons to help families that find rents beyond their affordability, and we try to use that to help minimize mobility in and among our schools, which affects student achievement negatively. Our community schools are there for employment assistance, try to find affordable childcare where it exists, language and legal services, and most recently providing enough access to the internet so that students and families can have access to the entire educational program of the Bethlehem Area School District. These community schools require financing, they establish real challenges, and if there should be an influx into resources available to school districts, they're tried and true, and we would be able to readily invest in those solutions. We have been working very hard on probably the most significant academic issue of our time, improved literacy for young children. It was mentioned earlier by one of the members of the panel that if a child has secure literacy skills by the end of 3rd grade, they have the keys to the kingdom for the rest of their education and many life outcomes. The transition to more scientific, evidence-based approaches to teaching reading is expensive. It requires extensive teacher training, training of principals, data systems, new curricula, new assessment measures, teaching parents and board members what it means. That has been the work of the Bethlehem Area School District for the last 8 years, and we are seeing significant improvement in the early reading of our students. We want to be able to maintain and expand that, because if you were a student who had your education interrupted by the pandemic, you missed out on that, but you still have reading gaps moving into 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, and those gaps are harder to close. We need to support our Career Pathways program. We say in Bethlehem that you should be doing something in 11th and 12th grade that you plan to do in your post-secondary career. Whether that's a dual enrollment course, whether that's a job shadow, whether that's an internship, whether it's successfully completing a dual enrollment or advanced placement course, you should be connecting your life after high school with your life during high school. Again, that requires a lot of curriculum development, a lot of additional work, staff and personnel, to truly prepare students for career paths. Finally, we have a long waiting list for students who want vocational technical education at our Bethlehem Area Vocational Technical School. Some of those programs have long waiting lists, some have facilities that need upgrading, some have outdated equipment that needs to be replaced. We all hear now how important it is to go pro early, get the skills you need. The 4-year college track is still a viable and a very attractive direction for students, but the vocational technical path is more important than ever. And we're having waiting lists and inadequate facilities for those students who want to make that important choice. To conclude, I'm both an educator and a taxpayer in my own community. So the state definitely has an obligation to insist that funding be conditioned to tried and true evidence-based solutions. I'm all about that. There's no money for inefficiency, weak ideas, or maintaining ineffective systems. But there are strategies, such as the ones that I have mentioned and outlined today, that if receiving greater focus and resources would lead to improved and more equitable outcomes, I have no doubt. In Bethlehem, we are determined to end race, ethnicity, and economic standing as reliable predictors of student school success. Let me repeat that. In Bethlehem, we are determined to end race, ethnicity, and economic standing as reliable predictors of student school success. That's not a dream, it's a goal that equitable, fair funding can help support. Thank you for the opportunity to share my remarks with you today.
Thank you. Lynn Fueini-Hetten?
Yes, good morning. I'm Lynn Fueini-Hetten, the Superintendent of Salisbury Township School District. I would like to also reiterate my gratitude to the chairs, Sterla and Phillips-Hill, as well as our local colleagues, Representative Schweier and Senator Miller. Thank you for having me here today. While I've been superintendent since 2021, I began working in the Salisbury Township School District in the mid-90s. And we're very close to Salisbury Township School District, just a few miles from here. Salisbury is embedded between Allentown and Bethlehem although much smaller with about 1,550 students. We operate 3 school buildings and 1 administration building. And your task, of course, has been not only reviewing the distribution of funding, but also identifying how much each district needs. Certainly no easy task, and appreciate the hearings to understand more and engage with some experts in the field. A little bit more about us. Salisbury, smaller school district, $43 million budget, and $33 million of that, 76% of that, is generated from local sources. So our funding from state sources is only 21%. I was encouraged to hear Representative Chair Sturla's statement about buckets of money, because buckets of money for different purposes for districts, special education, transportation, facilities, and repair and upgrades through PlanCon, and also compensating for tax-exempt properties, creates a better model for equitably funding schools and students while also providing taxpayer equity too. Several areas I'd like to highlight that affect Salisbury Township School District. First, transportation. By law, we're required to provide transportation within our miles, or 10 miles from the district boundary. We operate 3 school buildings and transport to almost 40. We operate 3 school buildings and transport to almost 40 in our 11-mile catchment area. That total cost to transport non-pub and charter students is $706,000. Now that doesn't maybe sound as much as you hear the numbers from our colleagues, but that for Salisbury is 7 teachers, 7 professionals we can put in front of our students. We could bring back programs we had to reduce. We could hire a math interventionist for our secondary schools. We could hire a reading specialist. There's a lot we could do with that $700,000. Special education, you mentioned there's a separate funding commission, but I want you to be aware that 25% of our population is special education. The state average is 18%. So we're significantly over that percentage, and we're seeing students with more complex needs and being required to open additional programs to support those students. The third, charter school tuition. While the state has eliminated its contribution, as Dr. Silva highlighted, we're certainly still required to pay that tuition. We pay $18,000 for a regular education student and approximately $39,000 for a non-regular education or special education student. That's significant. The budgeted cost for Salisbury taxpayers for 23-24 is over $3 million. We need you to support that proposal to cap tuition for cyber schools and also fund charter school, provide that reimbursement. As an 11 square mile district with limited space for development and several large nonprofit organizations as landholders, our inability to increase tax revenue to meet our needs is crippling. Approximately 25% of our population, our property is tax exempt. This is extremely inequitable across other districts. So the state offers no compensation for that, so instead, our local taxpayers have to make up that difference. Although we do have a payment in lieu of taxes agreement, we still have millions of dollars in lost revenue. Years of underfunding, numerous state mandates have impacted Salisbury Township School District. In the absence of PlanCon funding and the presence of mandated cost increases for special education, charter school tuition, transportation, and more, the district has been unable to afford necessary facility upgrades. Additionally, in 2020, we consolidated elementary schools due to facility, maintenance, and financial issues, resulting in significant community conflict over the closure of our beloved elementary school. We raised taxes 11 out of the 12 past years, most recently to the Tax Act 1 index of 4.1%. That brought additional local revenue of about $1.2 million. That's all. Raising taxes to the max, $1.2 million in a $43 million budget. That money goes fast. Mandated costs, salaries, increases in health care, special education and cyber charter, we couldn't even pay all of those with that increase. The inability to raise more money through local taxes, state and federal revenue have left us in a position where we're forced to cut staffing and programs and do only bare bones improvements on our facilities. And our facility team works hard. They maintain our facilities to the best of their ability, but we need increased funding. We're unable to fund through our general fund those improvements, and many of the classrooms have the same furniture, carpet, even paint, and carpet on the walls that were there when I started teaching 30 years ago. We currently have a critical infrastructure list of approximately $10 million of projects which need to be completed, and these don't even include creating the kind of environment where we want our kids to learn every day. A welcoming and pleasing learning environment with bright walls and carpets, updated furniture. Our teams work as hard as they can with the resources we have to create the most physically appealing environment, but we need work on our systems and on our aesthetics. The BEFC must identify the steps needed to ensure our public schools will, in the very near future, give every child the public education they are entitled to in the facilities they deserve, without leaving the burden to local taxpayers. You need to fully fund special education, reduce charter school tuition or add reimbursements, eliminate transportation outside district boundaries, and consider formula exceptions for nonprofit tax-paying entities. I appreciate your service to the commission, and I thank you for your time and the opportunity to share Salisbury's story with you. I'm very proud of our district, the work our team does, and want to create the best learning environment for all of our students. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll now take questions from members. Representative Ortiz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to the three of you. Thank you for all the work that you do. I thought my job was hard, but after meeting with my local superintendents and seeing what all of you have had to deal with over the last few years, thank you for what you do. I have a couple questions, and all of you feel free to jump in here. We have talked about different buckets as far as funding. Would you prefer there be one bucket where we have everything all-inclusive that goes out, or would you prefer many buckets for specific purposes?
I guess I would prefer the one that we can have the most predictability and reliability that will be there so that it could affect our planning purposes. Obviously, the one that makes the most sense right at first thought would be facilities, because those are the ones that have the greatest amount of lead time, are the largest expenses. But it would depend on how consistent or how we could regularly expect that funding to be there.
I would say we'd like a large bucket of money, and so large bucket of money. So, and that districts have an opportunity to have some autonomy, given the guidelines, so that we can use the funding in the manner that the state has set without a lot of regulations. So,
I'll reiterate, I'm definitely for buckets, and for you looking very carefully at why the bucket for Allentown needs to be bigger in this area, percentage-wise, and the bucket for Salisbury needs to be bigger in this area, percentage-wise. So whatever those areas might be, whether it's the age of the facilities, whether it's the lack of local revenue, whether it's the large amount of nonprofit, non-tax generating land in the district, compensating for the differences in the district so that every child gets what he or she needs.
Now, you had mentioned at the end of your testimony, you had raised taxes to the index and raised, I think it was what $1.2 million
Approximately.
About which would you say your budget's about 44 million somewhere?
Approximately.
So I'm wondering, and this for all of you, Dr. Birks too, I was wondering specifically in your case, are you limited in what you can raise with local property taxes and local funding? And how does that really play into, I think I added it up correctly, about $100 million worth of renovations that you were talking about?
So we don't want to place the burden on the taxpayers. I think in our community that our taxpayers are overtaxed. And so this past school year, we did not raise taxes because, one, we did receive funding in terms of ESSERs, and we thought that it would be unfair for our communities to bear that tax burden, given if you're visiting our community now, and so many of the needs of our particular community. And so we will need the state to assist us with offsetting those costs, because it wouldn't be fair to the taxpayers. 'Cause they're
Okay, and that's
overtaxed.
that's the crux of what I just wanted to get into about, okay, if we all raise local taxes, what does that put us at? Because when we're looking at the big pot of money, I know we talked about the pie earlier, we have the local property taxes and local revenue in coordination with the state dollars that are coming in as well, and determining, all right, what are our local school districts doing to raise revenue or control costs, and what's the state doing to increase their contribution to it as well? Because that all adds up to what the total amount is, and trying to piece that together with a formula at times seems pretty daunting and almost impossible, especially because every single school district is so uniquely different. I mean, the issues that you're dealing with here, dealing with back in part of my rural part of my district, I had a roof collapse in a building that was only 40 years old. I know I say only 40 years old, but that's relatively new for a lot of schools that are out there. Now, I've been fortunate in certain parts of my district. I have schools that are building brand new facilities because they can do that, and they're growing rapidly, and they have incoming businesses and industry to help pay for that. But I'm wondering if your school districts are just, they're saturated at this point. There's no more land to develop. There's no more places for businesses to go. It is what it is at this point, and I imagine your inability to be able to find additional revenue has led us to where we are today.
That is accurate. That's correct.
And that's certainly true for Salisbury.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you all for what you do. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks. Senator Hughes?
Thank you all very much. Dr. Birks took me around, compliments of Senator Miller. I thought I had a couple 100-year-old school buildings in my district, and then showed me Grandpa School, whatever that school, 150,
Yes.
149 years.
They're 49 years old.
Yeah, that floored me. That floored me. And I've been to school buildings all across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to look at this issue, including a school building in southwestern Pennsylvania that had a car engine as its backup generator. And literally, I have the pictures to prove it, so I'm not making this up. But I really appreciate, especially Dr. Silva, your comments about literacy, and I'm a believer that we all have, if you will, a constitutional right to read, a constitutional right to be literate, and there's a lot of conversation about school buildings, school structure, school infrastructure, but if you just touch very briefly, because we want to get caught back on time here, about what it takes to deal with this issue of literacy and grade level reading and grade level math, and the impact of it, and the fact that COVID has had an impact on all incomes, on all geography, on all races, all across the country in terms of the falling back of literacy scores and math scores. We'll talk about that.
In terms of literacy, first it takes a recognition that there's a need, that there's a problem, and that you're going to have to develop school systems, schools' ways of operating that change curriculum, change instruction, change assessment, and change the professional learning of the teachers and the principals. When we did that in Bethlehem 7 years ago, we recognized that only 54% of our students at the end of third grade were proficient readers at grade level. We looked back at all of those 4 areas that I talked about and found that they were not really aligned to the evidence-based practices that are out there of schools that were showing improvement. Now, there's a significant cost to professional development, the amount of time that you have with your teachers. The data systems and the amount of formative assessment and the number of reading specialists needed to manage that system is a significant cost, not to mention the curricular materials. So getting and repositioning your school district has a significant, meets a significant challenge when you're talking about reading. But we have found that it had the opportunity to erase some of the more significant differences between the achievement of students in our highest need schools versus our lowest need schools. When we implemented those 4 strategies that I talked about consistently for a couple of years, we were seeing at the end of kindergarten, at the end of 2nd grade, some of those differences in student achievement disappear. And we were making progress on eliminating race and poverty as predictable measures of school success. Now, you are correct. The pandemic did set us back, not just in Bethlehem, but all across the country. So we are now seeing the first opportunity where our kindergartners are back now to where they were prior to the pandemic. But as I mentioned in my testimony, that ship has launched for some students who's now in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, and all the research will show you it's much more difficult and much more costly to close gaps with older students than it is with younger students.
Just to finish off the point, and it relates to something that I raised earlier, that given this generational unconstitutional inadequacy, we have high school, just to the point you just made, we have high school students who have been lost and left out for their entire academic experience. And so just to factor in what is necessary to get them where they need to be, to participate in some of the other programs that all of you are offering in your schools, that cannot be lost in this conversation. We would be making a dramatic mistake, another failure, if you will, if we miss that reality of what has to be done for those students who've been lost for years. I don't think you need to respond. I want to be respectful to the time. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Representative Topper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Talking about a new bucket of money that could be helpful as we look at potentially new ways, a transformational way to reform education and how we fund it, is a bucket designed to incentivize shared services. Dr. Birks, you made mention that within 5 miles, within 5 minutes, sometimes of school districts that are underfunded or school districts that have access to a completely different property tax base. What are some of the barriers that currently prevent us from looking at shared services, and how can we incentivize that better financially in terms of studies, in terms of cost in the transitory years, whether they be administratively, whether they possibly be, I'm not talking complete consolidation of districts, but maybe in some cases that would help, but also just integrating services more. Any idea of the costs that are associated that perhaps we could invest in and therefore ensure that we have access, that all of our districts have access to opportunities by expanding tax bases? Because the money that comes from us, from the state, also comes from taxes. I say all the time, we don't get our money from a bake sale either. So we're talking about taxpayers around the state and how we can best serve all of them.
I would think that initially, just having the conversation and the will. Now, I have to preface my comments. This is going to my 10th month as superintendent here in Allentown, and the majority of my career has been spent in Connecticut. But just from my entry planning work as a new leader in the district, I think there's some opportunities operationally that we probably can share in some of the costs. But I think it's going to be a lot more in getting at beliefs about and sharing services across other communities. And you know a lot more about this than I do in terms of how we got to where we are, whereas a city like Allentown, where, again, 2 minutes away, I'm not going to even go 5 minutes, 2 minutes away is a whole nother school district on the left and the right of us, that I believe that if we leverage the resources, that we could adequately fund and sharing some services operationally, if nothing else. And I agree with you on that.
There is the collective impact science that shows that when school districts and community organizations partner and agree to address the same issue in the same strategy, collect the same data, measure the same results, that there can be impact. An example of this would be like the community school model that I gave in my testimony, which is supported by the United Way of the Greater Lehigh Valley. But that's not just done willy-nilly, that's done through a collective impact model. That can be used for health services, that could be used for educational services. So there are new models, flexible models, where the same problems could be addressed by common agencies, related agencies, with just a greater degree of organization. For instance, the United Way is very strong in absence prevention, reducing chronic absence of schools. They have access to community resources, a loud mouthpiece, donors, who, if they work in collaboration with the Bethlehem Area School District on our attendance policies, could help make a difference. However, collective impact is not going to substitute for what the organization itself needs to do. So there are models out there, and some of them do work, like the community school model, and it allows us for an opportunity for some shared services.
And I just want to build on what Dr. Silva said. Now, my response to you is based on school districts, but internally, as a district, we're doing just that. We are partnering in the Allentown School District with all community providers. This summer, we served more than additional 400 students more than we would have because we worked with all our collective community partners to leverage our resources and plan consistent programming across the city. More than 60 or so nonprofits work with us so that we can support students. We also offered students internship opportunities so that we can meet workforce development needs. About 125 students participated in workforce development experiences, more so than ever before, because we leveraged our community to do this, that. And we know that there's great mental health needs across our district, and we are working, actually, one of your colleagues is supporting us with this, Representative Salisbury, in convening a social emotional learning task force so that all the community providers, so they can take all the 25 students you're serving and the 10 over here, and how we collectively work together to create reforms and intentional processes and protocols to impact the social emotional wellness of students across Allentown as well as their families.
And sometimes, from what my discussions with superintendents across the Commonwealth, is that one of the barriers to this is the fact that to get to a place 3 and 4 and 5 years down the road where they can save money on infrastructure, save money on shared services, the cost up front, though, scares a lot of people off, right? It's too dramatic to get to the point. And so that's kind of the last part of my question is there, do you see a way that if we provide some of another bucket in this formula that says, look, we will provide some help in some of the studies and costs up front to get you to a point where you're able to integrate either systems or potentially perhaps buildings as well. Is that something that, in your professional opinions, would be worth pursuing?
I think it's an interesting idea, and at this point, everything's worth thinking about, right? That's your work right now. And I'm thinking about this idea of shared services, and, our buildings are full. Like, we're not able to really take more students into our buildings. We have, for the most part. Our special education programs are full. So at times we do share services, offering slots to other districts where you may have a student who needs a specific program that you have available in your district. We've had districts ask us to share services like psychologists and social worker. Their caseloads are full. So this idea is really interesting, and what are the barriers? And it's something I would want to think about, and maybe the three of us could put our heads together to that idea and that question with some of our colleagues. Currently, our human resource is very stretched thin, and our financial resource is very stretched thin. So I'm not really sure what that would look like or what barriers there would be, and how you would mitigate those given the current constraints that we have.
I think so. Also, the mindset shifts, as I mentioned before, and beliefs about working together and the dynamic of the competition that's been created amongst school districts. So if there's a way that we as a collective educational community can come together with superintendents in the room saying, okay, here's the task, and you come with a plan, I think that people will rally together and respond on the benefit of children. Without a whole lot, and I know my state, local legislators know I say this, without a whole bunch of barriers and regulations and bogged down, you have to use X group to do this. I think we have enough intellectual capital amongst the superintendents that I serve with that we can come up with a solution if you come up with some money.
I love reduced regulations in government. You're speaking my language. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
More money.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that part of that is how can we reduce any costs? But even if we reduce costs by 10%, I now have Representative Topper willing to go to 5.6 billion on the increase instead of 6.2. Senator Williams.
Thank you. I want to thank each of you for testifying. I wrote down a bunch of quotes that were helpful. Equity lies at the heart of our mission, and when you hear somebody say this is not about money, it's about money. So I wanted to, more than a question, I wanted to elevate and thank you for talking about compensation for tax-exempt properties. That is a large problem. When you talk about leaving revenue on the table and you say a quarter of our properties are non-taxable, and then I have that same problem in Allegheny County with UPMC, and we don't have an agreement for payment in lieu of taxes. And those are the same entities that are then lobbying us, saying we don't have enough trained professionals to fill the jobs. Well, there's a reason. We have large nonprofits and large corporations not paying their fair share into our education system. So thank you for elevating that, and I hope that other districts that come before this commission elevate how much of their property in their district is not eligible for taxes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Senator Kristen Phillips-Hill.
There we go. Thank you so much. Thanks for your testimony. Thank you for being the educational leaders of your districts and your communities. You have really important jobs. And you know, I share my colleague from Philadelphia's concern about assuring reading literacy and math proficiency. I mean, at the end of the day, we heard so much about facilities. I think the reality is that's what our ultimate outcome is, right? Those are the key building blocks for the future of every student that goes through every Pennsylvania school. And I keep hearing from you that buildings are the impediment. I just want to point out that old infrastructure isn't necessarily bad infrastructure when it is maintained. And I say this, I have a school that was named a National Blue Ribbon School 3 years ago when it was 108 years old. It was built in 1912. Is it the fanciest? Is it the best? I will tell you it's in one of our more challenged communities. It's a Title I school, and the outcomes that they have achieved with those students, they are incredible. I know it can be done. So when we talk about dollars, and I asked this question earlier, and it was really about, that Dr. Kelly from Penn State, have you looked at how the money gets into the system, how we distribute that money? Because what I'm hearing is that, there's a concern with how that money gets into the system. I went back and I looked at Allentown's numbers. We're here in Allentown. Allentown has received the highest percentage and the second highest dollar amount of basic education funding since 1997 out of 500 public school districts in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So in 1997, Allentown received $27 million. And since 1997, I believe it's been a 538 538.1%, if my math is correct, a 538.1% increase in basic education funding. About $145 million increase in that time. So last year, I believe your numbers were about $172 million in basic education funding. And still, these challenges. And you're saying that you still don't have enough, you can't generate it here locally, but the state has put a huge investment into public education. Your former state senator was a great champion for this school district. So we're talking about things like nonprofits and government buildings not paying their fair share in taxes. In your opinion, how do we create that input if the existing structure of taxation is not working? How do we do that?
In terms of requiring them to, I want to make sure I'm clear about the question.
So we currently have a system of local school property taxes, state funding, and we're saying it doesn't work. So what are your thoughts on how we create a system that will create the funding necessary? Because quite honestly, you have received the greatest share, almost the greatest share of state tax funding. We have put historic amounts of funding into basic education, and you're saying the system still isn't working. So what does that system look like? Your colleague, Dr. Birks, to your right, I don't want to
Lynn Fueini-Hetten.
Dr. Fueini-Hetten has said, you know, the system of the way it's funded isn't working in her school district, right? She has the opposite problem. She gets very, very little from the state and is reliant on the local school property tax, and that's still not enough. So, you know, no one has thought outside. The answer seems to be we just need more money. But when I listen to you, you have continued to get more money. You have gotten level up funding, and that's been baked into your base for additional basic education funding, and that's still not enough. So it sounds like the existing structure of taxation, how the money gets into the system, is not necessarily working. Not working for an Allentown, not working for a Salisbury. So have you thought about reimagining how the money comes into the system?
Yes, and when I think about, in response to your question, just to put things into context, of our 400 now, because we have a little over $460 million, and because we received ESSER funding, $75 million of our funding is allocated to our charter friends, to our charter schools. So right off the top. So we transport their students much more than our own students in the district. And so that's one obstacle for us because of the funding that we appropriate to our local charter schools. I agree with you that as a community, we are looking as to how we reimagine ourselves and look at our funding more strategically and leveraging. And that's why I gave you those examples about our nonprofit partners and saying, okay, if you're receiving additional particular aid from various entities, federal and state, how can we leverage those dollars so that we, at scale, support our students and having them closely align what they're doing to our mission and our vision. There are, and I'll just speak for Allentown, various legacy projects throughout the district of good intentioned efforts, but are not aligned with, as what Senator Hughes said, focusing on the literacy and numeracy and all these efforts that are going to yield large-scale results for our students. So Fortunately,
Do you receive funding from these nonprofit organizations? Do you have foundational support for your school district?
we do, but as I mentioned, we as a district, and through our strategic planning, we're going to get to this, to make sure that everyone is coherently working in benefit to the mission and the vision that has been identified and the goals of the school district. So there are resources that we may receive from others, or they go out and pursue dollars, and that's why I've convened various groups. We even established an early learning coalition now. There are lots of nonprofit providers in this community. They receive resources, but now we're working in concert together so that we can affect early learning across the system and not just pockets of students receiving resources. I've been here for like 9.5 months. We also have brought together, as I mentioned, our workforce development partners. They receive lots of dollars as well, but we're coming together. How can we impact the system at scale and not just 25 students or 50 students? How do we have transformational change with the dollars that we are allocated? But we have to be working together. And we notice in Allentown, and I can speak as the authority because that's what they pay me to do, to serve the students, there's no coherence and alignment, and we're working towards that. So can we better utilize our research? Now, of course, we need more money. So I don't want anyone to walk away. We're not standing that we need more of that. But can we work more collaboratively to leverage those dollars to stretch and last longer and provide more intentional support? Absolutely.
Any further thoughts?
We haven't talked about our local intermediate units who also work with us to assist in sharing services and bringing us together. And we have, in the last couple of years, seen a lot more grant funding coming through from some of the community agencies that Dr. Birks stated in terms of supplementing, but it's really supplementing what we're not getting from the state or what we're not able to raise through local taxes.
Those additional dollars that you get, they're not reflected in your per pupil spending in any
Correct.
state-related information?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
And they're one-time dollars. I'll give you an example. A grant for a dual enrollment grant, the district, Salisbury Township School District was awarded. So we're able to send, I want to say, 90 students to some college class this year. But that's one-time money, and it doesn't help us for next year. So, it's a great way to get us started, but it's not sustainable.
So I appreciate these answers, but I think hasn't really gotten to the root of the system or the root of the question, which really is the existing setup of how we put money into the system working, or do we need to actually look at the way we collect those dollars to then send them to the school districts? So at some point, I think that becomes a fundamental question. When I read that decision, and I've gone through that copious document, it's not just how we distribute that money, but how we get that money into the system that I think is something that needs to be looked at. So thank you again for your testimony here today and for all that you do for students and communities.
Thanks. Before I go to Representative Schweier, because I'll let him wrap up with the local superintendents, I just wanted a couple questions or things to point out. While I think it was pointed out 6th or 7th in the nation in terms of total funding for basic education, we are, I think it's 46th in the nation in terms of the state's share of funding. And so that's where I think you get the impacts on the locals when if they were getting the same kind of local funding that the states that are in the top 10 were pushing to their districts, they wouldn't be saying, I care about my tax exempts, because they're getting all their money from the state at that point in time. We're giving such a tiny portion to these school districts of their dollars that they then have to go back out in the community and figure out how to generate it. Having said that, one of the things I know, and we talked about shared services, the one shared service in my county that probably has the biggest impact on my school district is the big county homeless shelter that exists in my school district. And that homeless shelter takes homeless people from the entire county, which serves 16 school districts, and concentrates them in one building in my school district, and that puts close to, actually somewhere a little over, 1,000 students per year in those school buildings. And that's one school district that takes the burden for 16 school districts. And while we fund at a little higher rate per pupil, we don't fund nearly as much as we should. And that tax exempt property never even thinks about it in lieu of tax payment, because they're concerned about the fact that they're dealing with thousands of homeless people every year. And so when we start to look at this, there's some of the districts that are the poorest districts in the state do more than any other school district with the dollars that they've got. And that goes to Dr. Silva's point of, it is about the money. I always say to somebody, if you don't think it's about the money, I'll take what your district does per pupil and I'll trade it with what my district does per pupil. And I've yet, in 33 years in the legislature, to have anybody take me up on that offer. So with that, Representative Schweier.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you to the three of you, not only for testifying today, but for all you do for our kids. I'd like to give a special thank you to Senator Phillips-Hill. Class of 2014, fun fact, she learned to be a legislator in the House, just like me and Jason Artite all came in together. We kind of stick together when in our classes. So when she complimented my legislative abilities for the incredible increase of the Allentown School District for my next couple of years, you came close. The only thing you did was forget to include me on that, but I'll take the win. Thank you very much, and I'm going to stop there before I get in any trouble. But I think Senator, you brought up an important point, and I think it's something that we need to have a conversation about. We have three very different school districts that share a border. They're all contiguous. Bethlehem Area School District is, in fact, a regional school district. They have very high and affluent areas of their district that has, they have an industrial base, they have all kinds of stuff in there. Salisbury is squished in between two very large school districts, and I say squished because literally they are not even contiguous. The Salisbury School District has a break in between the two of it. And then you have the Allentown School District, which is not only not a regional district like Bethlehem, which isn't a municipal district like Salisbury. We don't even have the entirety of the Allentown city in our school district. Y'all know what Dorney Park is, right? If you ask your friends if you're going to Allentown and you're saying, yeah, I'm going to Allentown, I'm going to Dorney Park. Dorney Park is not in Allentown. It's not in the Allentown School District. It's in the Parkland School District adjacent, which is one of the reasons why our property taxes in Allentown are 6 full mills higher, a little bit more than that, than the Parkland School District. We have the highest property tax rate in the entire Lehigh Valley. We don't even have the entirety of the city of Allentown. All school districts are not the same. And we can move to a regional county-based school district right now. And that might get to a point of equity. We might then start being able to have the conversation of why does Parkland School District, which is a tremendous school district immediately to the west of Allentown, which includes Dorney Park again, might have some things that are similar to Allentown. Still not getting to the question of adequacy. There are 2 points to our conversation with the Basic Education Commission. It is equity. We want to make sure that all of our kids have the same. We don't want a situation where a suburban school district or a wealthier or more affluent school district that has things like Dorney Park or the industrial parks out on Route 100 or any of those other things. We want those kids to have the same things that our kids have. We also need to make sure that all of our kids in our regions have what they specifically need, given all the challenges that our different kids have and different communities have, to be successful. And there is a challenge and there is a significant burden on a child, to Chairman Sterla's point earlier, who has experienced homelessness, English as a second language, recently moved to the United States. We have a growing Polish population in Allentown. Those are folks that are coming from adjacent to a war-torn country in Ukraine that are moving to Allentown who don't speak English as a second language, that are experiencing trauma, that are experiencing displacement, that are experiencing, not understanding how to ask to go to the bathroom at schools, every bit as much as anywhere else. And so not all students are the same, and we can start looking at things like consolidation and mergers and shared services. I think all of those things are absolutely worth talking about. Chairman Topper and I have had these conversations numerous times. But we cannot forget the term adequacy. There are two things that we're talking about today. It's equity and adequacy in the context of building. And so yes, we may need to figure out different ways to fund our schools, but at the end of the day, there's still a $6.2 billion gap in funding, carving out potential conversations about pensions and those sorts of things, but a number in the billions of not enough money that we are not spending on public education, and I don't want to lose that thread. That is an important part of the conversation. It's why we're having 12-ish hearings, plus everything else that we're doing is that we need to understand what the dollar figures are and how we're going to do a better job of dispersing them. Thank you, Chairman.
Now that we're only about 45 minutes late, we're going to completely do away with panel number 2. No, I'm just kidding. You all are excused, and we'll get the next panel up. Julie Cousler, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania School-Based Health Alliance, and Dr. Marilyn Howarth, Deputy Director of the Philadelphia Regional Center for Children's Environmental Health. And if you all will, I've got to swear you all in, so I'll swear you in as a panel. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before this commission will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
All right. All right. Ms. Cousler, would you like to start?
Sure. Good morning. My name is Julie Cousler. I'm the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania School-Based Health Alliance. I want to start by thanking the Commission for the opportunity to speak with you this morning and provide testimony. I appreciate and commend this important work. I'll speak about the importance of student access to health care in their school for Pennsylvania's students that live in poverty. And I've had the opportunity to talk personally with several of you about the importance of school-based health centers, Chairwoman Phillips-Hill, Chairman Sturla, Representative Isaacson, and Senator Vince Hughes. And a special thank you to Senator Vince Hughes for really shepherding the one-time health equity grant last year for all 32 school-based health centers across the state for their focus on mental health. So these hearings are about the varied needs of students in order for them to achieve academically. It's about education equity, and I would argue health equity. If you're not healthy, you cannot succeed, and more than half of students in poor districts are not healthy. School-based health centers are how thousands of school-based health centers across the country help students access preventive care, acute and chronic health care, as well as mental health care, so that all barriers are removed and students can be in school and ready to learn. A school-based health center is like having an urgent care center right in the school. In-school medical professionals, including medical doctors or licensed nurse practitioners, provide acute and preventive care. They render diagnoses and write prescriptions. The services range from health screenings, delivering sick and injury care, preventive well child care and sports physicals, administering flu shots and vaccines, providing confidential reproductive health care for teens, conducting mental health and substance abuse screenings and treatment, as well as dental care, vision, and more. A school-based health center is staffed not only by a medical provider, but usually a mental health provider as well. They work in critical collaboration with the school nurse, providing a very different but complementary service to the nurse, the social workers, and the counselors. There are many reasons why low-income students do not get their annual preventive routine wellness checks, their vaccines, or their quarterly check-ins. Oftentimes, students with asthma will not receive their asthma check-ins from their doctor, but rather the emergency room. We call these needs the social determinants of health. They are a parent's job insecurity, their inability to miss work or not be paid, money for transportation, or even health insurance. Around 40% of students in low-income districts have a complicated chronic condition like asthma, diabetes, or ADHD. Medications and treatments are confusing or complicated, and it's often hard to control the conditions that exacerbate their health problems, like the many asthma triggers for families that live in substandard, insecure housing, or dare I say, in their own old school buildings. So many of our students are not emotionally well either. Mental health was a serious problem for many of our students before the pandemic, but the distress has skyrocketed. School nurses, school-based health center providers, family doctors, and even teachers will tell you we are in a crisis level of need. The ongoing trauma is multifaceted. Living in poverty, experiencing trauma, and living with within a gun violence epidemic in many parts of the state. Today's 24-hour technology cycle brings real-world problems to every student every day on their phone, way before they're ready to absorb the despair. After our students were socially isolated for 2 years and didn't have an ability to grow and mature socially and emotionally at a critical time, the kids are not all right. As we consider how to increase educational equity in Pennsylvania, we must increase health equity as well. For children and adolescents, we must provide these services where the students spend most of their time in school. Students get treated by a medical provider and most likely sent right back to class. No need to make appointments weeks away, burden parents and guardians with missed work or scrambling for transportation. 23 states provide state funding for school-based health centers because of the need and the positive impact on their students. There are decades of research showing that school-based health centers decrease hospitalizations and emergency rooms, they decrease absenteeism, they increase compliance with vaccines and routine wellness checks, and they dramatically increase the number of students who access mental health care when they need it. We at the Pennsylvania School-Based Health Alliance, along with the operators of 32 school-based health centers across the Commonwealth, are currently working with legislators and agency leaders to level health equity so that children and adolescents can do better academically. I welcome the opportunity to talk further with you, with our great leaders, to make this vision a reality, like so many other states have done for decades. Thank you again for this opportunity to speak with you, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you. We're going to hear from Dr. Howarth, and then we'll ask both of you questions.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Marilyn Howarth, an occupational and environmental medicine physician and the Deputy Director of the Philadelphia Regional Center for Children's Environmental Health. I'd like to thank the Basic Education Funding Commission for the invitation to submit our comments regarding the current state of Pennsylvania school infrastructure and facilities and its impact on the health and development of children. The Philadelphia Regional Center for Children's Environmental Health is a collaboration between the University of Pennsylvania and the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, one of only 6 children's environmental health centers in the United States funded by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. For more than a decade, we've been working on environmental health problems in schools, including asbestos exposure, peeling lead paint, lead in drinking water, infrastructure-related water intrusion leading to mold growth, radon, and inadequate ventilation, which increases the transmission of respiratory illness. Children are a vulnerable population. Their bodies are still developing. They breathe a higher volume of air relative to their body size compared to adults, and they put their hands and other non-food items in their mouths. Schools should be a healthy place to grow and learn. Yet many of the 1.6 million Pennsylvania school-aged children attend a brick-and-mortar school that can harm their health. 71% of school districts have buildings in need of major repair, and those repairs are most often involving heating, ventilation, and cooling systems and roof repairs. In addition, 66% of school buildings in the Commonwealth were constructed before 1970, making them likely to contain asbestos-containing materials, and 78% were constructed at a time when lead paint was used. All school buildings built before 1986 are likely to have lead pipes, lead solder, or lead fixtures, all of which can deposit dangerous levels of lead in drinking water. It should be noted that the presence of these conditions does not always lead to exposure. Vigilant observation for damage and prompt remediation of asbestos and lead can keep children safe from these hazards. Our center has found that although many schools have damage involving hazardous materials, the early identification and prompt remediation of asbestos damage and flaking lead paint does not always occur. Deferred maintenance in schools is the cause of delays in correcting hazardous environmental conditions. Deferred maintenance occurs when funds are diverted to meet other educational needs rather than the repairs, causing greater hazardous exposure to children as these repairs create greater damage in the schools. Commonwealth schools have allocated only 7.5% of their budgets annually for the last 2 decades, resulting in unprecedented, unhealthy conditions in our schools. We recommend that the state require that school districts, as a precondition to any funding, commit to policies that annually allocate 15% or more of their budget to infrastructure maintenance. We recommend that the state require that all school districts publicly report EPA-required asbestos inspection findings and fund schools so that they can promptly address damaged asbestos-containing materials, lead paint, and roof repair. While most schools in the Commonwealth are likely to contain lead pipes, lead solder, or lead in fixtures, a minority of schools have tested their drinking water. In the 2018-2019 school year, more than 100 school buildings in 32 Pennsylvania school districts identified lead in their drinking water. Since 2018, 91 drinking water lead levels were more than 10 times the EPA limit of 15 parts per billion, and 7 were more than 100 times that limit. Drinking this water would certainly elevate a child's blood lead level and unquestionably harm them. We recommend that all schools be tested for lead test their lead in drinking water, and testing results be promptly reported to the public. Filtration of every drinking water outlet should be funded through the Commonwealth for every school where lead in water is identified. Air quality directly impacts childhood illness and learning. Mold due to water intrusion can lead to asthma exacerbations in children. 7.9% of Pennsylvania children have asthma, compared with 6.5% of U.S. children. Inadequate ventilation has been associated with the transmission of respiratory illnesses and poor concentration, and improving ventilation has been associated with improved cognition and reduced respiratory viral transmission. When central ventilation is not available, open windows and fans can bring in pollen, ozone, and particulate air pollution, as seen during our recent poor air quality events due to the Canadian wildfires. Pollen and particulate air pollution have been associated with diminished math and reading achievement in 5 to 8-year-olds. Some schools are located near high traffic areas. Traffic-related air pollution has been associated with poor student academic performance. Student absenteeism, largely driven by asthma exacerbations and respiratory illness, has been associated with adverse building conditions. And renovations, including mold remediation, ventilation improvements, and roof repairs, have been shown to be associated with significant test score improvement. Increased temperatures, as we've heard today, have been associated with reductions in math scores in elementary and middle school students. In older children, an association between increased temperature and lower PSAT scores has also been shown. Heat and humidity can trigger asthma exacerbations in children with asthma. We recommend upgrading ventilation systems in all schools and to improve ventilation rates to achieve 21 CFM per person. Air conditioning that can achieve temperatures less than 76 degrees, and filtration that can reduce particulate pollution indoors to levels consistent with good outdoor air quality, 5 micrograms per meter cubed. We also recommend providing adequate funding to promptly remediate mold and improve building infrastructure to eliminate water intrusion. Although most counties in Pennsylvania are classified by the EPA as having the highest potential for indoor radon levels, very few schools have been tested for radon. Radon can enter buildings at their lowest level, the basement or the first floor, exposing children and staff. Radon is a known human carcinogen causing lung cancer, which can take many years to develop. The longer the exposure, the greater the risk. We recommend that radon be tested in every school and be remediated when elevated levels are found. Although each of the hazards discussed have serious health impacts on children, the hazards rarely occur individually. They tend to cluster in older buildings in the poorest school districts. The cumulative health effects of these environmental conditions can be lifelong, diminishing cognition, causing chronic medical conditions, reducing academic achievement, and lifelong earning potential. I implore you to recognize the significant harm that continuing the status quo is having on Commonwealth children and take steps to remedy it. Thank you for the opportunity to submit this testimony. I'd be happy to address any questions or provide additional information.
Thank you. Before we get to members' questions, I'm going to put my colleagues from the administration on the spot here and say, is there any comprehensive list of facilities in the state of Pennsylvania, school facilities? Like, do we know within each school district how many buildings they have, what condition they're in?
Thanks, Representative Sterla. No, there's not anything like that that exists. I know that PDE before 2014 did a study, but it was voluntarily, the school districts that submitted it were voluntary, so no, nothing like that exists. We don't have the ability to collect that information.
Right. If we could get even the 2014, so we could see like, hey, within 50% of the school districts, this was what the situation was 10 years ago, that might even be helpful. But I think it might be something that at some point in time here, we might want to, when we go into executive session, talk about, do we need to get that information, as soon as possible? Questions?
I would say yes.
Representative Schwer.
Just a very, not a question, just a very quick point of clarification. The schools facility bill that passed bipartisanly out of the House included an amendment to that point authored by Representative Topper that was included in that overall bill. So we actually moved legislation as part of our overall package that would have included that as part of it, sir.
Thank you. Senator Hughes.
So there's, first of all, thank you both for your testimony. Appreciate seeing you both and working with you. There's no way that we can have this conversation without lifting up at least two individuals. Chelsea Mungu on May 4th, 2018, and it's reported in the Inquirer and on YouTube, wrote me a letter, and it got national attention on CNN. And she said in her letter, why when I go to school, do I feel like I'm in prison? At that time, she was attending the Cassidy School, which was over 100 years old. Had 4 floors, had no cafeteria, had no auditorium, and when it was time to bring the whole school community together, some of you are old enough to remember the concept of sashes and separating. My school administrators should know what I'm talking about, which would were sliding doors that would separate out classrooms. Needless to say, walking around the school, you could see that it was certainly 104 years old because the students and the teachers and the professionals were not the only ones in the school building. The rodents and infestation were a part of that process as well. That was 2018. We're now in the process of building a new Cassidy School. And hopefully by September of 2024, the students in that geography will have a new school that they can attend. That's not the case for all of the students, including Chelsea, who attended Cassidy and felt the need to address me. And I brought her to Harrisburg, and she was on the Senate floor. And I snuck her on the microphone, and she said something to the entire Senate body. And that's probably violated a rule or two in the Senate, but you're not going to tell this young lady that, you know. The day before, we heard on May 3rd of 2018, we heard from Dean Pagan. We heard Dean Pagan's story. And Dean Pagan's story was part of an exhaustive series in the Inquirer that talked about the physical conditions of schools. Dean Pagan's story, if you may have been more tragic. Dean is a little 6-year-older, and this has to be in the record, all right? Dean is a little 6-year-old student, May of 2018, whose lead chips were falling off the ceiling onto his desk. And Dean didn't want to swipe the lead chips onto the floor because he wanted to be neat. He wanted to be a little neat, little area. So he consumed some of those lead chips. He ate them. The Comley School in Northeast Philadelphia, another very old school building. And so if you read the article, Dean's father, David, will speak to you about the fact that Dean can't quite compute the way he used to. Can't quite move around the way he used to because he consumed lead chips. And so these are the stories. This is the reality. And this is happening all over the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Especially in lead, where we knew in 1974 lead paint was outlawed. You can't use it, lead-based paint. But most of our school buildings were built before then. And there's been no remediation of any significant end. I can't go any further in these hearings, in this conversation, without mentioning these two. And there's more. There's more. The loss there is our loss. And the gentleman didn't even calculate it into the numbers that he presented to us on the front end of this conversation. So we got to do this, and we got to have this conversation, and we got to fix this. I don't care what bucket it's put in, how it flows, where it goes. But in the spirit of these two students speaking for hundreds of thousands others, and maybe millions when you count the generational history, that there has been a lack of funding. Chelsea and Dean speak for thousands and millions of other students who didn't have a voice and were impacted negatively because of a historical, unconstitutional, and inadequate funding system. They are the names behind the numbers, and those names had to be lifted up in this conversation. Mr. Chairman, I don't have a question.
May I make a response, though?
Sure.
Senator Hughes, the one piece on that Dean Pagano story that you didn't mention was that the teacher actually saw him eat that paint chip. That was the only reason he was tested. What about all of the other children whose teachers didn't see them eat the paint chips and have the effects that we will not know about, and maybe they're just a little less smart than perhaps they would have been. We all, frankly, all of us that I'm seeing before me are a little less smart than our children because of the less lead that we now have in our environment. But in these circumstances where there's a big shot of lead, of 1 or 2 chips, that's all it takes to get lead poisoning. You know, you don't have to eat a lot of chips. He only had to eat 1 in order to be lead poisoned. I don't know how many he did eat, but his lead level was high. I don't remember what it was, but it was very high. So I would suggest to you that we we do not test children over age 2 because it's not medically recommended, because we don't expect our children to have these circumstances. So we don't even know the nature and the extent of the lead poisoning that may happen to school-age children because they are not tested.
Thank you. Representative Isaacson.
I just, as we're wrapping up here, wanted to bring something together with Julie's testimony with regard to access to health care, and many students, especially lower income students, having a lack of access to common basic health care that children need. And a lot of that has to do with their families not having the ability to get their children the access, because we've heard today about housing insecurity, clothing rooms, showers, and the basic needs of children in this Commonwealth having and being attended to only by the schools that are serving them. And that's something that we are going to have to take into consideration, I think, because it's even more predominant now than it was when we started back in 2008 or 2014. As we go through, society has changed drastically, and we need to recognize that as we're coming through this formula. So thank you for your testimony and highlighting that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Phillips-Hill.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. Wanted to talk about the school-based health care centers, and just get a sense of how these health centers are funded in these 23 school districts across the Commonwealth.
Well, the 23 is, that was the number of states across the
23
country.
I
Yeah,
apologize.
But we have 32.
We have 32,
That we know
okay.
of, although the gentleman spoke about school-based health centers in Bethlehem, so we're going to go research those.
Okay.
They're funded by insurance reimbursement, just
Okay.
like, your regular doctor's office. So it's, billing the students insurance for the visit. So most of these school-based health centers, those 32, they're in Title I schools, low income. There's lots of students that are uninsured or underinsured. Medicaid rates are low. Many of them are run by federally qualified health centers. They have a much higher reimbursement rate with a whole lot more regulation as well. But for a traditional clinic that's faced with Medicaid rates, those are low. And so generally across the country and in Pennsylvania, that reimbursement funds about 50 to 60% of the school-based health center's expenses. So the remainder is really made up by grants, one-time state grants, and that's billing for mental health services and for primary care. The schools do provide a lot of in-kind contributions, usually the space, the internet, the utilities, and a lot of leadership to work collaboratively, and that's our focus at the Pennsylvania School-Based Health Alliance, is really helping those schools and school-based health centers to be as strategic as they can, to collaborate with the school nurse, the counselors. They know which kids need more, to really wrap those students with services.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks. Senator Miller.
I just want to thank our panelists and also the Allentown School District for hosting this, and our staff. I really appreciate the testimony and the realities of what we're seeing here, and Dr. Kelly, you as well. Just really appreciate the opportunity to hear this testimony, so thank you very much.
Thanks. If I could just to follow up on Chair Phillips-Hill's question. A few years ago, one of the school-based health centers in my district called me and said, hey, we're having some issues because in our region, there are half a dozen Medicaid providers, and those kids in that school come from all half dozen of those Medicaid providers, And those Medicaid providers said that the school health clinic was not their primary health care provider. And so when a kid walked into that health clinic and they said, you've got pink eye, the insurer, the Medicaid insurer said, well, unless you refer them to their primary care provider, so the parent had to come in, pick them up, take them to a doctor's appointment, they weren't going to reimburse them for anything that was done to that kid. And when I called the department, they said, well, they just need to go talk to all 6 of those insurers and become a primary provider listed with each one of those 6 different insurers. And they said, fine, we'll go through the hoops and we'll jump through the hoops, and they finally ended up doing that. But I said to the department, so when we're handing out contracts to Medicaid providers, why don't we insist that school-based health clinics be considered a primary health care provider by right? And they said, oh, you don't know how hard it is to negotiate with these healthcare providers or healthcare insurers. And I'm like, you're giving them a $1 million contract, a $10 million contract, $40 million, you can't negotiate with them? I mean, I think it's imperative that we make sure that those school-based health clinics are guaranteed at least to get reimbursement instead of fighting for the meager amount of money that they're going to reimburse them anyway, and then having to fight like crazy to make sure that they even get that little meager reimbursement. So I don't know whether you can address that at all or not, but.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Our healthcare system is incredibly complicated. Credentialing, contracting are very complicated processes, and every clinic, every healthcare provider has a different setup, a different type of contract. Some have more flexibility, some don't. I believe a couple years ago there were some changes made so that a federally qualified health center does have more flexibility to get reimbursed for someone that is not, a student is not capitated to them. But that is with the intent for them to become, become their, within their medical home. And parents shouldn't have to do that. They shouldn't have to change the child's medical home just to be seen at their school-based health center. And a lot of the school-based health centers across the state do have, it's sort of a satellite site in the school, and so maybe not far away, like in York, are their headquarters, and a lot of the students in that school are in that catchment area and go there. So the school-based health center frequently is really open during school hours. But it's unique to each individual community. But that's a part of the calculation of school-based health centers, and why they why they end up subsidizing so much is that they can't get reimbursed for every single visit, but they generally serve everyone that needs the services and has parent consent.
Yeah. Well, in this particular case, what I was being told was that if a kid showed up in the school clinic and had pink eye, first thing that they could do is they would administer some medication right away. They would then make sure the kid had enough medication. They would call the parent and say, come get your kid. And 2 days later, the kid, because he had the medication in place, would be back in school. The alternative was the parent came and picked the kid up, went home, scheduled an appointment with a doctor. 2 days later, the kid got in to see the doctor, got the medication they needed. The parent had to take a day off work. The kid would show up anywhere from 5 to 10 days later. So instead of that kid missing 2 days of school, that kid was missing 5 to 10 days of school because of the complications involved with just getting through that process. If you didn't go through that, I can treat you right now and you're already started on this. You don't need to wait a day or two to get help. And so I can't say enough about the ability to keep kids in school with school-based health clinics is,
Absolutely.
From what I saw, was phenomenal, so.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just I'll be as brief as long as it takes, all right? Just a question. Surgeon General put out a report, I think within the last couple of weeks, around the impact of social media on mental health, especially with our young people. and something that we need to increase our level of attention on, because talking to a psychologist over the weekend about this issue, the unformed mind of many of our adolescents really cannot process appropriately what's happening with social media. Are our school-based health clinics, health facilities looking into this issue as well as in addition to what we traditionally deal with respect to pink eye and things of that nature?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a huge focus for the mental health providers in the school-based health centers. I spoke about it in my testimony that clearly with social media, there's bullying, there's predators on social media, but as I said, there's the real-world problems are in every student's face every day through social media, and they're just cognitively, emotionally not ready for it. My 19-year-old daughter, that's what she'll say to me when I talk about the rates, the increases, and she'll say that it's the real-world problems. We're steeped in it. They know everything that they should not know too early. So on a one-on-one level, absolutely, that's a huge focus for the mental health providers and the primary care providers too. And that's the beauty of a school-based health center. They're integrated. They work. You got the doctor or the nurse practitioner working really closely with that behavioral health provider, and that really is the value. But and then there's some that do psychoed curriculums in classes. That's the ideal and with support, financial support for school-based health centers strategically placed throughout the state, is that with additional support, they can really work with the school to be a school-wide culture of health and do much more than just the clinical primary care. A lot of the environmental health education, that it just can all be so integrated. There's some really incredible models across the country and here in Pennsylvania.
And I would just add that I too believe that it can best be done in a school-based model, because it's that early intervention and the integration. The counselor sees the problem, gets the child to the right care, and bullying can be intervened on early, and other mental health challenges too. So I really think that in particular for mental health, the school-based programs can be a game changer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We're only about an hour late. Senator Phillips-Hill.
Thank you, Chairman Sterla. Once again, thank you to Allentown School District for hosting this first on-the-road meeting of the commission. Thank you to Representative Schweier, Senator Miller for welcoming us to their district. Thank you to everyone who has testified, who has attended both in person and virtually. We will meet again tomorrow, which is Wednesday the 13th. We will be meeting in Harrisburg at 9 a.m. in the North Office Building. And then on Thursday at 2 p.m., we will be in Philadelphia at the School District of Philadelphia. And these will also be able to be viewed virtually if you'd like to continue to follow the work of this commission. Thank you all again.
Thanks. I just echo those comments, and thank you all for being here today, and look forward to hearing more from you. Thank you.
It's great to testify with you.
Yes, yes.
So well said, yeah. Thank you.